Hey everybody, I hope everyone is having a wonderful time. I'm reading this on the 29th of November, 2024, the day after Thanksgiving. Today I'm reading an entry from the Ideas of Leon Trotsky, edited by Hillel, Ticktin, and Michael Cox. The piece is titled Lenin and Trotsky, A Question of Organizational Form, ? And it's by Lynne Poole. Let's see if there's anything on Lynne Poole. I'm not seeing anything. So, let us proceed. I'm looking at a PDF and I got straight to the article I was looking to by guessing the page number, It said it was on 111. I was like, how many pages ahead do I think I need to skip? Considering, table of contents and all those things that are not properly part of the page count. And I guessed 120, and I jumped right to it. So it is going to be a good day. All right. Lenin and Trotsky, A Question of Organizational Form. Introduction. Despite having been organizationally separated from Lenin since the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1903, on the eve of the October Revolution, Trotsky found himself within the upper echelons of the Bolshevik Party, espousing a vision of radical social change which appeared fully to complement that of his longtime adversary. Wikipedia says, the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was held from July 30th to August 23rd, 1903, starting in Brussels, Belgium until August 6th and ending in London, England. Probably as a result of diplomatic pressure from the Russian embassy, Belgian police had forced the delegates to leave the country on August 6th. The Congress finalized the creation of the Marxist Party in Russia, proclaimed at the First Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. This Congress brought the first split within the party between the Bolshevik faction led by Lenin and the Menshevik faction led by Martov. The organizing committee for convening the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was originally elected at the Bialystok Conference held in March 1902, but soon after the conference, all the committee members but one were arrested. At Lenin's suggestion, a new organizing committee was set up at a conference of Social Democratic committees held in November 1902 in Pskov. On this committee, the Iskra-Is had an overwhelming majority, citation needed, end bracket. Under Lenin's guidance, citation needed, end bracket, the organizing committee carried out extensive preparatory work for the Second Congress. Draft regulations for the convening of the Congress were adopted at a plenary session held in Orel in February 1903. Following this plenary session, members of the organizing committee twice visited the local party organizations with a view to assisting them in their work. With their participation, the local committees discussed the draft regulations, after which the organizing committee finally endorsed the regulations and approved a list of the local organizations entitled under them to representation at the Congress. The organizing committee prepared for the Congress a detailed written report on its activities. There were 37 sessions and 51 delegates. at the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Of these, 33 supported Iskra, the party newspaper, 5 backed the Bund, and 2 were economists. Marxists who believed workers should concentrate on economic demands rather than political demands, 6 delegates were neutral, citation needed, During the 15th session, the delegates voted in favor of supporting a dictatorship of the proletariat as it approved into the party program the paragraph, quote, "A necessary condition for this social revolution is the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is, conquest by the proletariat of such political power as will enable it to suppress any resistance by the exploiters." End quote. The Congress saw the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks as a result of a dispute between Lenin and Julius Martov over the major points of the party program. At the second session, Lenin and Martov disagreed on the wording of the first party rule defining membership. Lenin proposed a party member should be someone, quote, "who recognizes the party's program and supports the party's program by material means and by personal participation in one of the party organizations." End quote. Martov's wording was slightly different. Quote, "regular personal association under the direction of one of the party's organizations." End quote. The dispute was about whether the party should have a loose membership or whether the party should be a party of professional revolutionaries. Georgy Plekhanov, founder of Russian Marxism, supported Lenin. Leon Trotsky, future leader of the Petrograd Soviet, backed Martov. The Congress voted 28-23 in Martov's favor, but his support included the 7 Bundists and economists who would later walk out of the Congress. This left Lenin's faction in the majority, so Lenin called his faction the Bolsheviks, or majoritarians. Martov accepted this, calling his faction the Mensheviks, or minoritarians, citation needed, At the 27th session, one of the constituent groups of the party, the General Jewish Labor Bund, asked that the Bund would be recognized as the sole representative of the Jewish working class in Russia. A Bundist delegate tabled a motion that all Russian citizens should have the right to use their own language, and Lenin and the Iskra group opposed the motion. It was defeated in a tie, 23 votes against 23 votes. However, a similar motion proposed by No Jordania, the leader of the Transcaucasian Social Democrats, was passed. Moreover, the Bund proposed that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party should have a federal structure with the Bund as a constituent party. This was defeated 41-5, 5 abstentions, Bolsheviks and Mensheviks were united in their opposition to the Bundist proposal, calling it separatist, nationalist, and opportunist. After their proposal was rejected, the Bund withdrew from the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The 2 economists also walked out when the Congress decided that the Iskras should represent the party abroad. Citation needed. The Second Central Committee was elected at the Congress. Iskra's editorial board became the party's central organ and was cut from 6 to 3 members, Lenin, Plekhanov, and Martov. Back to the text. In an attempt to explain Trotsky's apparent change of heart, regarding the Bolshevik organizational form, theorists have tended to utilize Isaac Deutscher's convergence model, inspired by the post-revolutionary writings of Trotsky himself. Advocates of this model argue that Trotsky, finally realizing Trotsky's errors, came to embrace Lenin's organizational line, as laid out in What is to be Done, after the February Revolution of 1917. In addition, it is argued that during this same period, Lenin himself embraced Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. Thus, these 2 revolutionaries came together under the Bolshevik banner after years of bitter polemicizing and division. Tony Cliff, following the same pattern, though from a partisan viewpoint, sums up Trotsky's embrace of Bolshevism as follows. Quote, Trotsky, ... for some 14 years refused to accept Lenin's concept of the party, which Trotsky wholeheartedly embraced only in 1917, ... End quote. In a similar vein, Barak Paz attributes Trotsky's joining the Bolsheviks to his coming to terms with the central importance of, quote, purely political devices, end quote, in revolutionary social change and the lure of power. Footnote. Tony Cliff, Trotsky towards Tony Cliff, Trotsky, 1879 to 1917 towards October. Yeah, I believe Tony Cliff also wrote a big biography of Trotsky, similar, I think, in structure. I think there's like 3 of them, to Isaac Deutscher's. I think Cliff published them in the 90s. I don't know if they were intended as a replacement for Trotsky's, for Deutscher's trilogy, but they don't seem to have had the same staying power as Deutscher. And Barak Kanai Paz is a critical book about the social and political thought of Leon Trotsky. I just actually finished reading that book in its entirety, so that'll be on the channel completely. Eventually, every 2 weeks, there'll be an installment put up on the channel. Back to the text. Insofar as these analyses do not recognize Lenin's changing organizational position, but rather emphasize Trotsky's mistakes, especially with regard to the party, they are inadequate. It is the aim of this chapter to challenge this model, and in doing so argue that it was in fact Lenin who, in light of the revolutionary events of 1905, reevaluated his organizational position, and thus essentially closed the organizational gap between Lenin and Trotsky. In arguing from a position which refutes any major organizational divergence between Lenin and Trotsky from 1905 onwards, it is necessary to explain why Trotsky did not join the Bolshevik Party at this time. Hence, it is the second aim of this chapter to demonstrate that from 1905 onwards, Lenin and Trotsky remained separated primarily as a result of non-organizational differences, most importantly, Trotsky's factional conciliationism, Lenin's rejection of the theory of permanent revolution, the nature of the coming Russian Revolution, its relation to the international situation. The importance of these differences varied over time, and as some were resolved, others developed and took on greater significance. Hence, from 1905 to early 1917, the two remained separate despite their informal organizational reconciliation. In order to analyze the non-organizational differences which kept Lenin and Trotsky apart, it is necessary to consider their political and theoretical relationship within the context of the factional struggle between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Despite the two struggles being in no way conflatable, the relationship between Lenin and Trotsky can only be understood in the context of the history of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, as the struggle between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks consistently had an effect on the relationship between these two revolutionaries. Hence, throughout this chapter, reference will be made to the development of factional divisions and reconciliations insofar as they are related to the position of Lenin vis-a-vis Trotsky. Finally, it is important to note that this chapter will primarily draw on the pre-1917 writings of Trotsky wherever possible, whilst avoiding much of the defensive work Trotsky produced in response to Stalin's attacks, in which Trotsky appeared, in my view, to be overly concerned to demonstrate Trotsky's credentials as a Leninist, thus both underplaying and distorting the differences between himself and Lenin in the period prior to the October Revolution. New section. Lenin's early thinking. The, quote, draft program of the Social Democratic Party of 1895 set out Lenin's view of the developing struggle between Russia's young proletariat and the capitalist class in this early period. Footnote. No footnote. Here, Lenin argued that the struggle often takes an isolated economic form in its first stages, but develops into a class struggle with political aims as the economic battle increasingly brings workers into conflict with the state. In fighting for improved conditions, The workers naturally begin to question the nature of the social structure and the role of the state and government. They thus come to understand more clearly the nature of their oppression. Lenin at this time recognized that political or revolutionary consciousness could spontaneously develop through economic struggle. In the true Marxist sense, the worker could become conscious insofar as the worker acted politically. The Lenin of 1895 perceived a link between the strike and political consciousness. And Lenin recognized a real potential for workers to reach consciousness through their own actions and analysis. There is then, at this time, no role for the party, or more specifically the socialist intelligentsia, in the bringing of consciousness to the workers from outside. However, the failure of the 1895 to 96 strike wave to win any notable advance left Lenin questioning the potential of economic and hence trade union struggle, and thus marked the beginning of an evolution in Lenin's thinking, which with particular regard to the role of the political party. Indeed, as Antonio Carlo argues, in Lenin's analysis of the limits of such struggle, Indeed, as Antonio Carlo argues, in Lenin's analysis of the limits of such struggles presented in his, quote, The New Factory Law, end quote, one can see the beginnings of a commitment to an organization united in struggle as the method through which to squeeze more adequate concessions from the employers. Footnote. Antonio Carlo, Lenin on the Party, Telos, number 17, fall 1973, and end footnote. Footnote. V.I. Lenin, The New Factory Law, Collected Works, Volume 2. End footnote. According to the abstract from the Telos website, Antonio Carlo's essay or article, Lenin on the Party, says, Today there is a great interest in reconstructing Lenin's thought concerning the relation between vanguard and masses. Lenin's definitive theses on the problem are seen to have been outlined in Lenin's famous and much discussed work, What is to be Done, which for some remains the only scientific answer to the problem, not fully developed by Marx and Engels, of the passage from, quote, class in itself to, quote, class for itself. For others, this work, impregnated by intellectualism and idealism, is seen as a classic of the Stalinist era and is held to be the root of all the bureaucratic deviations of the Soviet experience. Back to the text and footnote. The significance of the party for Lenin in this period was increasingly its perceived potential to extract political results from the economic struggle, thus preventing the government from watering down economic concessions after the chaos had subsided. Hence, in the article, The Task of the Russian Social Democrats, Lenin emphasized the practical importance for political advance of an autonomous workers' party rooted in the factories. Footnote. See Lenin's article, The Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats in Collected Works, Volume 2. End footnote. However, it is clearly the case that at this time, Lenin gave something like equal weight to the economic and political aspects of the struggle. Equally clear from this work is Lenin's continued focus on the spontaneous nature of workers' struggle and political consciousness. However, in the period of stagnation after 1897, Lenin took his re-evaluations of 1895 to 96 a stage further. Lenin argued that the division between the working class movement and socialism, or its theorization, was damaging. The movement needed theoreticians, and that meant principally the intelligentsia. Lenin therefore argued for the fusing of, quote, socialism with the working class movement in a single social democratic movement, end quote, in order to facilitate the transformation of the class struggle of the workers into the conscious struggle of the proletariat to emancipate itself. Footnote. Lenin, Footnote, Lenin's article, A Retrograde Trend in Russian Social Democracy, in Collected Works, Volume 4, end footnote. In this way, then, Lenin elevated the political struggle and its organizational forms above those of the economic struggle. In fact, Lenin began to argue the position most clearly illustrated in What Is to Be Done, that theoretical socialism, and therefore the intelligentsia, is the source of proletarian consciousness, essentially, in this period, characterized by extreme autocratic political repression and the rise of, quote, revisionism. Lenin deemed the workers to have less potential to develop political consciousness through spontaneous economic struggle. Lenin thus advocated the formation of a strong vanguard party of professional revolutionaries to organize politically and lead the struggle. This period of reorientation culminated in 1902 with the publication of What Is to Be Done, in which Lenin finally subordinated the economic to the political struggle. Thus we see the first example of Lenin's thinking undergoing an evolution in the face of new objective conditions. New section, the 1903 Congress. Before focusing in more detail on the content of Lenin's new vision, as laid out in What Is to Be Done, and Trotsky's critique of this work, it is necessary briefly to summarize the events which both led to the split of the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and provided the context for the organizational debate which subsequently followed between Lenin and Trotsky. It is clear that whilst the party as a whole came to the 1903 Congress verbally committed to replacing the loose federation of disparate groups which made up the social democratic movement with a centralized Marxist party, its unity did not hold up in the face of Lenin's clash with Martov over the question of party membership. Footnote. This was most clearly illustrated by the party's general united opposition to the Jewish Bund's call for autonomy within the party. End footnote. Footnote. The contentious paragraphs on party membership are cited in V.I. Lenin's One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. Wikipedia says, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, The Crisis in Our Party is a work written by Vladimir Lenin and published on May 6/19th, 1904. In it, Lenin defends his role in the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party held in Brussels and London from July 30th to August 23rd, 1903. Lenin examines the circumstances that resulted in a split within the party between a Bolshevik, quote, majority faction led by Lenin himself and a Menshevik, quote, minority faction led by Julius Martov. Written in 1904 in response to controversies within the Social Democratic Labor Party's Second Congress regarding the status of party membership and organization, Lenin frames this conflicting factionalism within the party in terms of dialectics. According to Lenin, there are two conflicting factions within the party, quote, the revolutionaries, which consist of the majority of party members, the Bolsheviks, and the, quote, opportunists, which are the minority, the Mensheviks. Rosa Luxemburg, a Marxist living in Germany at the time, responded to the article on organizational questions of Russian social democracy. Luxemburg criticized Lenin's attitude towards democratic centralism and wrote about the role of, quote, spontaneity among the working class. However, different authors make varying claims about Luxemburg's precise attitude towards Lenin, the Bolshevik faction, and the revolutionary situation in Russia. Back to the text and footnote. Neither Trotsky nor the group which became known as the minority or Menshevik faction could accept Lenin's organizational vision. Indeed, in his report of the Siberian delegation, Trotsky, supporting the Menshevik position, argued that Lenin's schema did not take account of those organizations already formed through struggle and increasingly influential among the workers, which carried out work alongside the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, but did not officially belong to it. Trotsky insisted that it was neither acceptable nor prudent to set up an organization based on a formal blueprint yet independent of the political reality of the period in which it would function. Rather, it was necessary continuously to adapt the structure of the organization to the movement of the time as it actually existed and developed. In this way, then, Trotsky anticipated the, quote, theory of organization as a process, end quote, commonly attributed to Rosa Luxemburg. Footnote. See Antonio Carlo, Trotsky and the Party in this book. I've already recorded that piece, so it will be up on the channel. End footnote. Trotsky then went on to argue that Lenin's formalism separated the party from other forms of organized opposition, concluding that rather than excluding these groups, the Central Committee would do better to work alongside them, and thus attempt to influence them. Footnote. Trotsky, Report of the Siberian Delegation. End footnote. Choosing to support Martov's position over that of Lenin, Trotsky thus argued for the primacy of the educative argument over organizational formalism and rigidity. End footnote. Not end footnote. Sorry, I don't know why I said that. It is clear that the break between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks over the organizational question marked the beginning of the split between Lenin and Trotsky, who at this time supported opposing tendencies. Footnote. It is interesting to note that in 1901, Trotsky had written in favor of a strong central committee at the head of the Revolutionary Party, and had even gone so far as to suggest that local organizations refusing to recognize its full powers ought to be cut off from the party, although only in exceptional cases. Unfortunately, it would appear that this document no longer exists, and thus one is forced to rely mainly on Trotsky's own references to it, principally in his report of the Siberian Delegation. Here Trotsky argued that this position was arrived at in a period when he was essentially cut off from all practical work, and thus in the light of experience he could reject it in favor of the position laid out in Our Political Tasks, which was more based on reality. Whilst this appears, in my view, to be the best explanation one can attain, given that the document itself is missing, it has in fact been refuted by a number of commentators, perhaps most importantly Cliff. He argues that Trotsky's position of 1901 is indeed his, quote, true position. Hence Trotsky's public attack of Lenin at the 1903 Congress and in his Our Political Tasks is seen simply as the result of his personal friendship and indeed reverence for such as Martov, rather than a principal disagreement with Lenin's organizational schema of 1902. Furthermore, this allows Cliff to argue that Trotsky's embrace of Lenin's organizational form in 1917, although belated, was both wholehearted and natural given his true position, masked by polemics and personalized posturing, as laid out in 1901. Of course, in my view, this interpretation can be dismissed as both inadequate and misinformed. End footnote. This organizational division between the two deepened over the coming months, Trotsky's Our Political Tasks being published in 1904. New section, Trotsky's critique of what is to be done. Wikipedia says, for what is to be done, says, What is to be done, Burning Questions of Our Movement is a political pamphlet written by Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin in 1901 and published in 1902, a development of a, quote, skeleton plan laid out in an article first published in early 1901. What is to be Done's title is taken from the 1863 novel of the same name by the Russian revolutionary Nikolai Chernyshevsky. The text's central focus is the ideological formation of the proletariat. In What is to be Done, Lenin argues that the working class will not spontaneously become political simply by fighting economic battles with employers over wages, working hours, and the like. To educate the working class on Marxism, Lenin insists that Marxists should form a political party or vanguard of dedicated revolutionaries in order to spread Marxist political ideas among the workers. The pamphlet in part precipitated the split of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party between Lenin's Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Lenin first confronts the so-called economist trend in Russian social democracy that followed the line of Edward Bernstein. Lenin explains that Bernstein's positions were opportunist, a point expressed by the French socialist Alexandre Millerand as in taking a position in taking a post in a bourgeois government. Against the economist's demand for freedom of criticism, Lenin advances the position that the orthodox Marxists had the same right to criticize in return. Lenin stresses that in the struggle against the bourgeoisie, revolutionary social democrats would need to pay particular attention to theoretical questions, recalling Engels' position that there were three forms of social democratic struggle, namely political, economic, and theoretical. Lenin hypothesizes that workers will not spontaneously develop class consciousness due to economic conflicts with their employers or through spontaneous actions like strikes or demonstrations. Instead, revolutionaries need to form a political party to publicize Marxist ideas and to persuade workers to join. Lenin argues that understanding politics requires understanding of all society, not just workers and their economic struggles with their employers. Quote, class political consciousness can be brought to the workers only from without, that is, only from outside the economic struggle, from outside the sphere of relations between workers and employers. The sphere from which alone it is possible to obtain this knowledge is the sphere of relationships of all classes and strata to the state and the government, the sphere of the interrelations between all classes, end quote. Lenin. Reflected on the wave of strikes in late 19th century Russia, Lenin writes that, quote, the history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by the working class's own efforts, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, end quote. That is, combining into trade unions and so on. However, socialist theory in Russia, as elsewhere in Europe, was the product of the, quote, educated representatives of the propertied classes, end quote. The intellectuals are, quote, revolutionary socialist intellectuals, end quote. Lenin states that Karl Marx and Engels themselves, the very founders of modern scientific socialism, belong to this bourgeois intelligentsia. Back to the text. In What is to be Done, Lenin set out to define the principles of party organization appropriate to the contemporary conditions existing in Russia, more specifically the illegality of oppositional party organization. Furthermore, as has already been suggested, Lenin sought to argue that the potential for the proletariat to develop class consciousness, if left to its own devices, was limited, and that this had important implications regarding both the essential functions of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in the revolutionary process and the form that the party must take in order to be most effective. It is clear that for Lenin of 1902, worker-led spontaneity, taken by itself, would result in nothing more than trade union consciousness. The proletariat, being naturally limited to trade union consciousness, needed the party, or more specifically the socialist intelligentsia, making up its ranks, to bring socialist consciousness to it from without. Footnote. It is important to note that Lenin was clearly referring to the proletariat as a whole when he made these arguments, and not just that of Russia. This is illustrated, for example, when he wrote in What is to be Done, quote, the history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by the working class's own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, ... End quote. Lenin, What is to be Done, Collected Works, Volume 5. That's actually a very interesting, distinction that Poole is making there. because a lot of people talk about, what is to be done. I mean, I don't actually know the content of the book, so I am talking a bit about my ass, but like Lars Lee's book, What is to be Done in Context, or whatever it's called. I'm not sure if I'm getting the title right. Basically, and other people have argued, we need to see, what is to be done in context, and that Lenin is solely speaking of the particular conditions of Russia, and not making like general theoretical statements or something to that effect. I could be like totally fucking making dog shit out of what is actual people like Lars Lee's argument. But the degree to which Lenin's thought in what is to be done is our general theoretical positions about working class and socialism in general, or just specifically talking about Russia, whether or not Lenin is doing either in those in that piece, is an important is important, like making the distinction between, and like organizing the general from the particular in that case. Anyway, very interesting. End footnote. If the party failed in this task, bowing to the dictate of working class spontaneity, the party would simply fail the class and hinder the social democratic movement. Indeed, Lenin went on to clarify the central point, citing Kautsky in support of his position, that the vehicle for developing consciousness beyond the confines of trade unionism is the radical socialist intelligentsia. However, it will be argued here that Lenin's view that the working class alone can develop only trade union consciousness is spurious. In forwarding this position, Lenin incorrectly conflated, quote, consciousness and, quote, theory. History does indeed illustrate that socialist theory has exclusively been developed by the intelligentsia, as Lenin alluded to himself. The very fact that workers work in production implies that workers will have limited energies to devote to the task of theorizing. But social democratic consciousness is not the same as the theoretical doctrine of social democracy, the former being developed outside the realm of the intelligentsia. More specifically, socialist consciousness can indeed come from the workers themselves, given that the workers' interests are determined by the objective conditions of their class position. Hence, insofar as the proletariat acts politically, engaging in class struggle, it can, in and of itself, develop a socialist consciousness, even if one accepts that the party has an important role to play in the fight for socialism, as indeed Trotsky does at this time. It is not the task of that party to provide the proletariat with an awareness of the proletariat interests through theory, so much as to assist the proletariat in the fulfillment of those interests, which the proletariat can recognize through its own political actions, through the coordination of class struggle. Following Marx, Trotsky in his Our Political Tasks made the essential point when he wrote, quote, Marxism teaches that the interests of the proletariat are determined by the objective conditions of its existence. These interests are so powerful and so inescapable that they finally oblige the proletariat to allow them into the realm of its consciousness. That is, to make the attainment of its objective interest its subjective concern. Between these two factors, the objective fact of its class interest and its subjective consciousness, lies the realm inherent in life, that of clashes and blows, mistakes and disillusionment, vicissitudes and defeats. The tactical farsightedness of the party of the proletariat is located entirely between these two factors and consists of shortening and easing the road from one to another. End quote. Trotsky, Our Political Tasks. Indeed, how can one accept that the intelligentsia is the bringer of consciousness when it does not share the objective position of the proletariat? In accepting this position as the correct one, Lenin appears not only to break with Marx, but in Trotsky's view, to cheat history by attempting to substitute the party's intelligentsia for the conscious proletariat. Returning to Lenin, it is clear that given his assumptions regarding the limits of, quote, unassisted proletarian consciousness as laid out in What is to be Done, Lenin was able to insist, and this is absolutely central, that the Revolutionary Party must by necessity embrace the services of the intelligentsia if the proletariat is to be provided with the proletariat's socialist consciousness. Footnote. At this point, Lenin was careful to emphasize that the inclusion of the socialist intelligentsia as central players within the Social Democratic Party did not exclude the broader mass of workers from participation. Lenin argued that workers had a part in creating socialist ideology, but as theoreticians rather than as workers. End footnote. However, having refuted Lenin's claims regarding the necessity of the intelligentsia to bring to the workers social democratic consciousness from without, it was subsequently possible for Trotsky to deny the necessity of such a central role for the intelligentsia within the proletarian party itself. Footnote. Carlo presents an excellent critique of Lenin's position on the intelligentsia's role in bringing consciousness to the proletariat through the party. See his article, Lenin on the Party. End footnote. Indeed, while maintaining that the intelligentsia does have a role in the party, albeit more limited, Trotsky argued for the more familiar mass party, which consists principally of workers, who themselves have the role of political actors and organizers, rather than the role of theoreticians. Trotsky thus argued against the notion of an intelligentsia-dominated party. Footnote. Trotsky, Our Political Tasks. One can summarize so far that while Trotsky saw an important role for the intelligentsia, in terms of theoretical development of social democracy and even as actors within a socialist party itself, Trotsky did not accept the inflated role that Lenin ascribed to them. Furthermore, Trotsky, in my view correctly, refuted the central Leninist notion of the unlimited potential of unchecked proletarian consciousness. Trotsky saw more potential in worker spontaneity than Lenin at this time, and denied that without the radical intelligentsia, the workers would be entirely lost to bourgeois ideology. Rather, Trotsky believed that the workers themselves were not only capable of attaining consciousness independently through political struggle, but could lead the revolution from the front in the form of a workers' vanguard organized into a mass proletarian party. Having presented Trotsky's critique of Lenin's views regarding the limits of spontaneous proletarian consciousness and its implications for the role of the intelligentsia in the Social Democratic Party, it is now possible to take up the second, though intimately related issue, that of the organizational form. Firstly, it is important to be clear that from the outset Lenin argued against the appropriateness of the form of the German Social Democratic Party for Russia, insisting that the notion of a mass party was unattainable where parliamentary democracy was not yet in place. Secondly, though not entirely unrelated, Lenin argued that given the Russian conditions of autocracy, it was not possible to wage a political struggle in the same way as the workers would wage an economic struggle, that is through mass participation and in public. Rather, as has already been suggested above, Lenin proposed that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party should ideally consist of a small, quote, professional revolutionary corps which would work to organize the class struggle from within a secret organization. He argued for a social democratic party in Russia which would rigorously incorporate the principles of centralism and discipline in order to match the centralism and discipline of the Interior Ministry and thus succeed in its aims. Footnote. Lenin used the German example to illustrate that, quote, without the, quote, dozen, end quote, tried and talented leaders, and talented men are not born by the hundreds, and talented men are not born by the hundreds, end parenthesis. Professionally trained, schooled by long experience, and working in perfect harmony, no class in modern society can wage a determined struggle, end quote. Lenin, What is to be Done, Collected Works, Volume 5. End footnote. Clearly, while Lenin attempted to emphasize the potential participation of the masses in the Revolutionary Social Democratic Party, arguing that, quote, our first and most pressing duty is to help to train working-class revolutionaries who will be on the same level in regard to party activity as the revolutionaries from amongst the intellectuals. Sorry, there's italics there, so I'm going to read it. Our first and most pressing duty is to help to train the working class revolutionaries who will be on the same level in regard to party activity as the revolutionaries from amongst the intellectuals." End quote. Lenin appeared consistently to undermine the importance of the mass party as traditionally conceived by Marxists. Footnote: Lenin's What is to be Done, Collected Works, Volume 5. Herein lies the source of Trotsky's discomfort. Lenin had characterized the form of the, quote, ideal party as one which was small and secret, with a group of, quote, professional revolutionaries at its core. Furthermore, it was their function to lead the struggle against the existing regime. However, for Trotsky, such an organizational form had within it inherent dangers if allowed fully to develop. Firstly, Trotsky charged Lenin with inviting, quote, substitutionism. Trotsky argued that this core of, quote, professional revolutionaries, which in essence would form the leadership of the social democratic movement, themselves would become the center of the movement's socialist consciousness. All the workers outside the party, even those within it, would be relegated to the position of at best technical functionaries. Hence the party in effect would find itself above the proletariat, acting in its name, but separated from it. Trotsky believed this would deny the proletariat's own historic role. Moreover, Trotsky went on to argue that while it was necessary to confront tyranny at all levels, as indeed Lenin himself argued, it was the proletariat itself which was obliged to do this under the leadership and guidance of the most advanced section of the working class, which would ideally be organized into a proletarian mass party. Footnote: In What is to be Done, Lenin argued that struggle in the economic sphere of society is insufficient by itself to advance the social democratic cause. Lenin asserted that the party must seek comprehensively to expose the autocracy's abuses, oppression, and violence, no matter what class is affected, and in doing so, this draw the masses into political struggle on the widest basis possible. Lenin was clear that while social democracy includes the struggle for reforms, social democracy is not entirely reducible to this. On the contrary, most important is the demand for an end to the autocratic regime and the subordination of the struggle for reforms to the wider struggle for freedom and socialism. End footnote. This was not the same as the party, dominated by intellectuals, carrying out these tasks on behalf of the workers and then informing the latter of these actions at a later date. For example, through the Social Democratic paper, Trotsky clearly argued that the form of the party laid out in What is to be Done would lead to the substitution of itself for the conscious proletariat. However, he insisted that this substitutionism would not be tolerated by the workers themselves. They would break away from the party and carve out their own path. Footnote: It is important to note that whilst he wrote of how, in theory, Lenin's organizational methods would lead to the, quote, party organization, quote, substituting, end quote, itself for the party, the Central Committee substituting itself for the party organization, and finally the dictator substituting himself for the Central Committee, end quote, it would be a mistake to attribute to Trotsky a prophetic quality in this particular case, as do many of Trotsky's commentators. This is because Trotsky had already asserted that if such a tendency towards substitutionism was to take any tighter grip on the party, the working class would move away from it and carve out its own independent course. The party would then lose its social base and disintegrate. End footnote. Hence, Trotsky feared that in blinding himself to the threat of substitutionism, Lenin would succeed in not only destroying the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party as it was developing at that time, but also in discrediting and bringing down the social democratic movement as a whole, thus leaving the proletariat to its own devices, that is, without organizational form or adequate leadership. What was necessary for Trotsky, then, was the extension of the base of the party to include more workers, who would actively participate in political struggle and maintain their roots in and close contact with the proletariat. The vanguard was obliged to be more closely linked to the class by a mass party membership. Theory on its own was just theory. For it to be meaningful and useful to the workers, it had to be integrated within their political action and experience as it occurred in reality. The second charge that Trotsky leveled at Lenin and the Iskrists was that of sectarianism, an overemphasis on the battle for control of the intelligentsia, and the neglect of the most important of its tasks, that of politically educating and shaping the masses, and developing close organizational links with the revolutionary class. In succumbing to sectarianism, the Iskrists had forwarded the notion of a very specific discipline, one which required no less than the subordination of oneself to the Central Committee and the program written by that committee. Trotsky attacked this conception of discipline, arguing that to insist that party dissidents remain quiet in the name of discipline would be to fail to see the worth of internal debate. Indeed, such discipline for Trotsky, quote, crushes the vital interests of the party, end quote, as it would prevent internal debate and hence encourage complacency by the party leadership, who as a result were protected from being asked to justify their actions or prescriptions. Where am I? This in itself was dangerous, given that it decreased the need for the committees to base themselves on the workers. They had in essence found themselves a new base, that of the, quote, principles of centralism, end quote. Footnote. Note that here Trotsky was referring to Lenin's form of centralism rather than the general principle of centralism per se. Trotsky's conception of centralism was bound up with the maximum local autonomy that unity allowed for, and could not be separated from the principle of democracy. End footnote. The party's potential for, quote, degeneration was therefore heightened, and is essentially Trotsky's third criticism of Lenin's proposed form of the party. However, this potential threat of degeneration was made even more real given Lenin's response to the charge that his proposed party format was undemocratic. Indeed, on the issue of democracy, Lenin insisted that the argument against this format on the grounds of its flouting of democratic principles, its lack of elections and public accountability, for example, was a sterile one, as it ignored the central importance of Russian conditions, that is, the persistence of autocracy. Lenin argued that a social democratic party functioning in conditions of Russian autocracy could not be democratic simply because it had to be effective, that is to say, secret. Moreover, Lenin argued that any threat of degeneration into self-interest was guarded against by the very fact that the party leadership consisted of, quote, professional revolutionaries, end quote, who had, quote, a lively sense of their responsibility, end quote. This argument was clearly entirely inadequate and reduced the principle of democratic accountability to mere blind faith. Indeed, Trotsky inferred as much when Trotsky asked why a proletarian party member should be content in the knowledge that a, quote, professional revolutionary, end quote, above him was supervising things and had everything in order. In summary, it has been argued here that Lenin conceived of a social democratic party which would have, at that party's center, a small core of, quote, professional revolutionaries, end quote, drawn principally from the intelligentsia, at least in the first instance, which would be organized into a highly disciplined, highly centralized format appropriate for the task of pushing the proletariat into political action. In response to the schema laid out by Lenin in What Is to Be Done, Trotsky highlighted a number of problems. Trotsky pointed to the dangers of substitutionism, the tendency to slide into sectarian squabbling, and a lack of concern for internal party democracy. He therefore prescribed that the strong Central Committee, which for Trotsky as well as Lenin was seen as a necessary inclusion, be tempered by a broadly based rank-and-file movement which would play a central rather than peripheral role in party life. Trotsky thus looked to a centralism governed by scrupulous democratic arrangements made possible only if social democracy remained essentially a mass movement. Furthermore, Trotsky attacked Lenin for attempting to control the proletariat from above rather than harnessing Furthermore, Trotsky attacked Lenin for attempting to control the proletariat from above rather than harnessing the proletariat's spontaneous growth of consciousness and maintaining organizational roots within the class itself. Trotsky favored the maximization of local autonomy and the reduction of the central bodies to functions of coordination, rather than prescription. For Trotsky, the principle of centralism could not be separated from the principles of democracy and maximum proletarian participation without there being disastrous effects to the whole social democratic movement. If the party failed to educate and mobilize the class by seeking to take the shorter route of substitutionism, it would be forever dragging the class behind it. By the end of 1904, the organizational divisions between Lenin and Trotsky were clear. Lenin's analysis of the Russian class struggle at the turn of the century had taken Lenin away from his position of 1895. Moreover, it had led to a split within the social democratic movement, with Trotsky responding with his critique of Lenin in the form of Our Political Tasks. The book, Our Political Tasks. However, the revolutionary events of 1905 saw a rapid development of the class struggle, which culminated in Lenin once again shifting his organizational position in response to the new conditions in Russia during this period. This time, Lenin's reevaluation brought Lenin much closer to Trotsky. One moment. Events lend weight to Trotsky's conception of the party. How did Lenin's organizational view develop in the period of upturn marked by the events of 1905? Whilst it is beyond the scope of this chapter to offer a detailed account of the 1905 revolution itself, it is necessary briefly to summarize those events which, in my view, precipitated Lenin's organizational reassessment. Footnote. See Trotsky's first-hand account, 1905. End footnote. In the first instance, the events of 1905 were characterized by a large spontaneous outburst of the masses in response to Bloody Sunday. Wikipedia says Bloody Sunday, also known as Red Sunday, was the series of events on Sunday, the 22nd of January 1905, in St. Petersburg, Russia, when unarmed demonstrators led by Father Georgy Gapon were fired upon by soldiers of the Imperial Guard as they marched towards the Winter Palace to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas II. Bloody Sunday caused grave consequences for the Tsarist authorities governing Russia. The events in St. Petersburg provoked public outrage and a series of massive strikes that spread quickly to the industrial centers of the Russian Empire. The massacre on Bloody Sunday is considered to be the start of the active phase of the Revolution of 1905. In addition to beginning the 1905 Revolution, historians such as Lionel Cohan, in his book Russia and Revolution 1890 to 1918, view the events of Bloody Sunday to be one of the key events which led to the Russian Revolution of 1917. Now I'll read the description for the Revolution of 1905. Why not? The Revolution of 1905, also known as the First Russian Revolution, began on the 22nd of January 1905. A wave of mass political and social unrest then began to spread across the vast areas of the Russian Empire. The unrest was directed primarily against the Tsar, the nobility, the ruling class. It included worker strikes, peasant unrest, and military mutinies. In response to the public pressure, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to go back on his earlier authoritarian stance and enact some reform issued in the October Manifesto. This took the form of establishing the State Duma, the multi-party system, and the Russian Constitution of 1906. Despite popular participation in the Duma, the parliament was unable to issue laws of its own and frequently came into conflict with Nicholas. The Duma's power was limited and Nicholas continued to hold ruling authority. Furthermore, he could dissolve the Duma, which he did 3 times in order to get rid of the opposition. The 1905 revolution was set off by the international humiliation that resulted from the Russian defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, which ended in the same year. Calls for revolution were intensified by the growing realization of the need for reform by a variety of sectors of society. Politicians such as Sergei White had succeeded in partially industrializing Russia but failed to adequately meet the needs of the population. Tsar Nicholas II and the monarchy narrowly survived the revolution of 1905, but its events foreshadowed what was to come in the 1917 Russian Revolution. Many historians contend that the 1905 revolution set the stage for the 1917 Russian Revolution, which saw the monarchy abolished and the Tsar executed. Citation needed, end bracket. Calls for radicalism were present in the 1905 revolution, but many of the revolutionaries who were in a position to lead were either in exile or in prison while it took place. The events in 1905 demonstrated the precarious position in which the Tsar found himself. As a result, Tsarist Russia did not undergo sufficient reform, which had a direct impact on the radical politics brewing in the Russian Empire. Although the radicals were still in the minority of the populace, their momentum was growing. Vladimir Lenin, a revolutionary himself, would later say that the revolution of 1905 was, quote, the great dress rehearsal, without which the, quote, victory of the October Revolution in 1917 would have been impossible, end quote, Lenin. Back to the text. Most importantly in this context is the fact that this spontaneous outburst had a political character and was accompanied by a series of strikes and demonstrations. The repression which followed these outbursts gave rise to a period of relative calm, although sporadic incidents of unrest were still apparent. However, in October, an all-Russian political strike erupted, its participants presenting demands for an 8-hour day, widespread civil liberties, and the convening of a constituent assembly. Out of this political strike, and more specifically the Revolutionary Workers' Council of Self-Management, grew the St. Petersburg Soviet. Trotsky argued that this Soviet was purely class-founded, spontaneously rising, and incorporating unorganized, scattered workers into its non-sectarian, non-party-controlled activities. It sought to coordinate and spread the strikes, and in doing so increasingly came to the forefront of the political struggle. The People's Soviet, indeed the revolution itself, were defeated, not least by the issuing of the October Manifesto, and by the level of oppression the state was prepared to administer. Wikipedia says, the October Manifesto, officially the Manifesto on the Improvement of State Order, is a document that served as a precursor to the Russian Empire's first constitution, which was adopted the following year in 1906. The manifesto was issued by Tsar Nicholas II, who lived from 1868 to 1918 and ruled from 1894 to 1917, under the influence of Sergei White, who lived from 1849 to 1915. On the 30th of October 1905, as a response to the Russian Revolution of 1905. Nicholas strenuously resisted these ideas, but gave in after Nicholas's first choice to head a military dictatorship, Grand Duke Nicholas, threatened to shoot himself in the head if the Tsar did not accept White's suggestion. Nicholas reluctantly agreed and issued what became known as the October Manifesto, comprising certain rights in elected parliament called the Duma. and an elected parliament called the Duma, without whose approval no laws were to be enacted in Russia in the future. According to his memoirs, White did not force the Tsar to sign the October Manifesto, which was proclaimed in all the churches. Back to the text. However, the importance of the events of 1905 in terms of their effect on Lenin, and in a different way on Trotsky, cannot be underestimated. The experience of 1905 demonstrated to Lenin the positive potential of mass self-activity and spontaneous proletarian initiative. Furthermore, these events demonstrated the central importance of the mass strike and re-emphasized the connection between economic and political struggle, which Lenin himself had played down since the late 1890s. Lenin responded by re-evaluating his own position on these issues in the light of both the events of 1905 and the organizational changes forced by the rapid influx of new members into the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which resulted from the revolutionary upturn. The changes seen in Lenin's analysis can be broadly divided into three areas. Lenin's re-evaluation of spontaneity and the working class's potential to act in a politically conscious way, independently, the rise of the Soviets as a spontaneous class-based organizational form in its relation to the party, and the changing form of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in conditions of increased political freedom and the radicalization of the working class as a whole. Each change, as I will demonstrate, brought Lenin even closer to Trotsky's organizational orientation. Let us first look at Lenin's re-evaluation of mass spontaneity. Having seen the masses act independently of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party leadership, Lenin was essentially forced to rehabilitate working-class spontaneity as a politically important factor in revolution. The need for the party to push the masses from without seemed to Lenin less important than Lenin had thought in 1902. Moreover, at this juncture, Lenin recognized the potential for workers' self-initiative, their organizational abilities, and the use of the general strike as a revolutionary tool. Footnote. See Lenin's article, Revolutionary Days, The First Steps in Collected Works, Volume 8. End footnote. Lenin felt more confident to, quote, rely fully and solely on the free initiative of the working masses themselves, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. See Lenin's Our Tasks and the Soviet of Workers' Deputies in Collected Works, Volume 10. End footnote. This reevaluation of mass spontaneity, coming in the spontaneous development of an organizational form, the Soviet, revolutionary in its aims yet outside of party control, brought Lenin broadly into line with Trotsky. Furthermore, it gave rise to a positive evaluation of Lenin of the Soviet itself, and thus marked another shift towards the position held by Trotsky. At this time, then, both Lenin and Trotsky believed the party and the Soviet to be equally necessary in the revolutionary struggle. Although many of Lenin's Bolshevik comrades did not agree. Footnote. Carlo, in his article Trotsky and the Party, is correct to dismiss Brouillet's claim that Trotsky and Lenin remained at odds regarding the Soviet. End footnote. Footnote. For example, Bogdanov, an old Bolshevik, took up an anti-Soviet position on the grounds that such a non-party organizational form would challenge the Social Democratic Party, perhaps becoming the nucleus of activity aimed against the Social Democratic Party. Bogdanov thus called for the Soviet to accept party authority and its program or face the withdrawal of party support. End footnote. Moreover, both were against the adherence of the Soviet to a single Social Democratic Party program, a move that would in effect represent the elevation of the party over the Soviet, whilst at one and the same time assigning the party an influential role within the Soviet. Marcel Liebman correctly sums up the position when he argues that Lenin was ultimately in favor of taking part in the Soviet, while trying to increase its links with the party in terms of political activity, as Lenin recognized the Soviet's ultimate organizational weakness, that is, its lack of central authority. Footnote. See M. Liebman, Leninism under Lenin. Wikipedia says Marcel Liebman, lived from 1929 to 1986, and was a Belgian Marxist historian of political sociology and theory, active at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and I don't know, via Universiteit Brussels. The description for Marcel Liebman's Leninism under Lenin says, this comprehensive and dynamic Deutscher Prize-winning book, Liebman rises about the dogmatism and sterility that plague most appraisals of Lenin, and persuasively makes the case that the Russian revolutionaries' political ideas have an enduring relevance for today's activists. Marcel Liebman was a historian of socialism and communism. I'm actually going to read a little bit more from the Liebman's Wikipedia entry. A historian of socialism and communism, Marcel Liebman published a number of well-known essays, notably on the Russian Revolution, Leninism, and the history of the labor movement in Belgium. Marcel Liebman was also an early initiator of Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. On the 9th of July 1943, Marcel's older brother, Henri, was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to Malines or Malines, I don't know, Malines. Several weeks later, on the 31st of July, he was transported to Marcel's older brother was transported to Auschwitz with 1,555 other deportees, where he was in all probability sent to the gas chambers upon arrival, as he had not yet turned 16 of age. Henri was born the 15th of October 1927 in Brussels and died in August 1943. Of the 1,556 deportees sent to Auschwitz on the 31st of July, only 40 returned after the camps were liberated. From 1962 to 1967, Marcel Liebman was editor of the weekly journal La Gauche, which means left, and in 1968 founded the journal May, which existed until 1973. In 1976, Marcel Liebman participated in the creation of the Association Belgo-Palestinienne with Naim Kader and Pierre Galland, and he was general secretary. Marcel Liebman's son, Riton Liebman, is a comedian, author, and director. Riton's actual name is Henri, named after Marcel's lost brother. The foundation, under the directorship Matteo Alalouf, was created at the Université Libre de Bruxelles upon Liebman's death in 1986. In December 2005, the foundation was converted into the Marcel Liebman Institute. It aims to contribute to socialist thought and the study of the left, as well as a critical reflection on the practices of social movements. Liebman's books include the introduction to Isaac Deutscher's Russia After Stalin, published in 1969, the book The Russian Revolution, Leninism under Lenin, and Born Jewish, A Childhood in Occupied Europe. His essays include The Webs and the New Civilization, Communication on Survey, published in New Left Review, 1914, The Great Schism, The Crisis of Belgian Social Democracy, Israel, Palestine, and Zionism, Lenin in 1905, A Revolution That Shook a Doctrine, in Sweezy and Magdoff's edited volume, Lenin Today, 8 Essays on the 100th Anniversary of Lenin's Death. Isaac Deutscher as Historian of the Russian Revolution. Bukharinism, Revolution and Social Development. Reflections on Anti-Communism with Ralph Miliband. Reformism Yesterday and Social Democracy Today. And with Ralph Miliband, Beyond Social Democracy. Okay, so back to the text. End footnote. Wait, no, not end footnote. Leninism under Lenin by Marcel Liebman says, the first all-Congress of Soviets was not held until 1917. Note also that in Our Tasks and the Soviet of Workers' Deputies, Lenin called for an all-Russian political center, but argued that the Soviets would be too narrow a base. End footnote. Indeed, Lenin argued for Social Democrats to form tight groups within the Soviet in order to direct the Soviet in accordance with party activity and thus maximize the influence of social democracy over the class. Essentially, for Lenin as for Trotsky, the Soviet was a means of connecting the party more closely to the class. It did not render the party superfluous, and it remained of great importance, especially in terms of the ideological leadership that it could provide. Thirdly, how was the party itself actually changed in the wake of 1905? Clearly in this revolutionary period, the party in the form it took in 1902 seemed increasingly to lag behind the masses. If the leadership was to keep abreast of class action, it would have to increase its organizational links with the masses, the vanguard with the class. Indeed, Lenin not only fully recognized this, but Lenin also accepted the need to incorporate into the struggle the ideas of party sympathizers who had not formally adopted the party program. The idea was to encourage a broader alliance by increasing the points of contact that the party had with these individuals and organs, and thus increases its influence over them. Thus, one can again see the parallels in Lenin's schema in 1905 with that laid out by Trotsky when Trotsky wrote in 1906, quote, "The revolutionary character of the epoch does not allow us to work systematically to create a broad and stable organized basis for the party. In the period of upsurge, the huge mass of the proletariat is drawn into the movement. In order to master it politically, the party has to restore to the mediation of broad non-party organizations." End quote. It has to resort to the mediation of broad non-party organizations. End quote. Trotsky. A letter to that's from a letter to P.B. Axelrod. That was published in the Journal of Trotsky Studies. End footnote. I was seeing if I could find an abstract for that piece, but I can't. Numerically, membership did in fact increase substantially in this period. Footnote. Liebman quotes the membership figures as 8,400 in January 1905, 34,000 in spring 1906, and 46,000 in 1907. That's those figures are from Marcel Liebman's Leninism under Lenin. End footnote. Numerically, membership did in fact increase substantially in this period, forcing a more democratic and flexible party structure, especially given the parallel liberalization of the regime. As Lenin argued, the influx of new members, increasingly from a variety of social layers rather than principally from the socialist intelligentsia, required new organizational forms. The organizational reform advocated by Lenin in this period was also identified by Lenin as the precondition for the application of the elective principle, which would itself ensure the participation of all party members in party decision-making. In the reorganization of the party, Lenin explained how under new conditions with increased political liberties, the elective principle should become the aim. Hence he concluded that at this time, as conditions began to change, it was both appropriate and necessary for the party to prepare for the development of a legal apparatus whilst maintaining a clandestine organizational nucleus. Such a view was first expounded by Lenin as early as June 1905. Footnote: see Lenin's Two Tactics of Social Democracy and the Democratic Revolution. Wikipedia says Two Tactics of Social Democracy and the Democratic Revolution is one of Lenin's early writings. It was written in June and July 1905 while the Russian Revolution of 1905 was taking place. Lenin's preface poses a certain question, quote, in educating and organizing the working class, ... where shall we place the main political emphasis in this work of education and organization? On the trade unions and legally existing associations, or on an insurrection, on the work of creating a revolutionary army and a revolutionary government, end quote. Back to the text and footnote. Again, then, there was a clear shift in Lenin's position which brought Lenin's conception of the party closer to that of Trotsky, emphasizing the need for a mass membership and a body of aligned supporters to link more closely the party vanguard, which both Trotsky and Lenin continued to support throughout, to the class as a whole. Lenin now envisaged a party which would be increasingly under the sway of the workers themselves, who would form a majority and be able to exercise their influence to the maximum with the application of elective principle. There would therefore be a decrease of absolute committee powers and central committee control, and the Congress being the new, more broadly based seat of control. Moreover, in this period, the principles of democratic centralism were outlined as a means of making local organizations the principal organizations of the party, increasing the autonomy of regional sections of the party and the freedom to criticize within the party, albeit within the framework of unity of action, and putting into practice the right of minorities not only to exist within the party structure, but to freely express their views. Footnote, quote, the principle of democratic centralism and autonomy for local party organizations implies universal and full freedom to criticize. As long as this does not disturb the unity of a defined action, it rules out all criticism which disrupts or makes difficult unity of action decided upon by the party, end quote. Lenin, Freedom of Criticism and Unity of Action, Collected Works, Volume 10. Note that according to Lenin, it is the Congress which has the power to decide when criticism must cease in the interests of unified party action. End footnote. Footnote. They were written into the party rules in 1903 to 04, but became a reality only in 1905 to 1906. End footnote. So, we see in 1905 an evolution of Lenin's thought, in particular with regard to organizational questions, which essentially brought Lenin theoretically closer to Trotsky. This is not to say that Trotsky did not also respond to new conditions, but rather to emphasize that the principal movement regarding this issue was to come from Lenin. We are thus left in this period with a situation in which both Lenin and Trotsky were now essentially in agreement over the question of increased party membership, increased working class influence within the party, and an increasingly flexible, more democratic party structure within which this could take place. The inflow of new party membership the inflow of new party members on a huge scale ended the restricted advocacy embodied in What is to be Done. Footnote. In the article Should We Boycott the Duma? And the article Reorganization of the Party, Collected Works, Volume 10, Lenin wrote for the first time of a mass party in terms of both membership and structure. One second. Okay, end footnote. New section. The disunity of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks swing to the left. At this juncture, it is important to note that whilst Lenin moved closer to Trotsky regarding the organizational question, Lenin's own party faction, on the whole, did not. This is important, as the seriousness of Lenin's response is illustrative of his commitment to the revised organizational schema. The old Bolsheviks, who remained at this point committed to Lenin's organizational scheme as laid out in What is to be Done, and who had worked in clandestine conditions prior to 1905, found the transition to a more open party form difficult. They were essentially conservative and pro-stability, rejecting inter-party democracy more than changing Russian conditions dictated as necessary. Hence, at the Bolshevik Congress in 1905, there was a serious confrontation between the supporters and opponents of change. The division was so important to Lenin that he felt it necessary formally to dissociate himself from the views of these comrades over this question. Footnote. See Lenin's Our Tasks in the Soviet of Workers' Deputies. End footnote. Given that this period led Lenin to reevaluate his organizational orientation, one would expect that the revolutionary upturn marked by the events of 1905 would also influence the Menshevik position, and indeed it did, though Trotsky himself had a key role to play in this. Whilst the organizational disputes of 1903 in some ways grew out of and indeed masked the underlying programmatic differences that existed between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, Trotsky had at this juncture chosen to align himself with the latter, the Mensheviks, on the organizational question, despite Trotsky's fundamental disagreement with the Menshevik stance on class allegiances and the potential for proletarian hegemony in the coming bourgeois revolution. See Pantsov, Trotsky, Lev Davidovich Trotsky in Soviet Studies and History. Or A. Pantsov. Let's see if there's anything for that. Okay, so there's an abstract for this article. It is extremely difficult to write about this man, or Trotsky. Trotsky's personality is complex, many-sided, and contradictory. Trotsky's creative legacy is enormous. As far back as 1924 to 27, it added up to 12 volumes, 14 books, although it was far from complete. Preparations are underway in the Federal Republic of Germany at present to publish an 80 to 100 volume collection of Trotsky's works. The bibliography of works devoted to Trotsky, which have mainly been prepared and published abroad, also adds up to dozens of books and articles, but that's just one side of the problem. The other is the fact that there are many among us who persist in believing that they have known everything about this man for a long time, despite their being unaware of this abundant material. The fault for this, of course, lies not with the reader, but with those who, starting in the late 1920s, fed the reader with a pseudo-theoretical substitute, preferring to consolidate society not on the basis of consensus arrived at in the course of free debate among associates, but rather essentially based on the ideas of the Bakuninist publications of the People's Reprisal. Society, in which, in the words of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, thinking and science are categorically forbidden to young people as being, quote, worldly activities capable of fostering doubt in the all-destroying orthodoxy, end quote. I don't know, that kind of seems like they just copy and pasted like the first paragraph of the article, so got to hold that with a degree of skepticism. Anyway, back to the text and footnote. However, these programmatic differences with the Mensheviks were sufficiently important for Trotsky to break from the faction as early as 1904, though Trotsky still cooperated with the Mensheviks practically. Footnote. Deutscher notes how at the end of September 1904, Trotsky's open letter to comrades announced Trotsky's break with the Mensheviks. Whilst not published in Iskra, its contents, in particular Trotsky's criticism of Fyodor Down, were in part reflected in his private letter to Yuli Martov and Fera Sasulich. At a closed conference which he attended, the issues Trotsky had raised were discussed, and it was decided that the émigré Menshevik organization be disbanded. This formal decision, whilst not carried out, did serve to free Trotsky from the organizational discipline and ties of Menshevism. End footnote. In his book, My Life, Trotsky wrote of how in 1905, whilst not formally a member of either faction, Trotsky worked consistently with the Bolshevik Krasin and local Menshevik groups who both supported non-participation in the First Duma. Wikipedia says Leonid Krasin lived from 1870 to 1926. Leonid Krasin was a Soviet politician, engineer, social entrepreneur, Bolshevik revolutionary, and a Soviet diplomat. In 1924, he became the first Soviet ambassador to France. A year later, Leonid Krasin left Paris to become ambassador to London, where Leonid Krasin remained until his death. Leonid Krasin was an early and close associate of Vladimir Lenin and his financier and the first finance wizard of the Communist Party. End footnote. In late 1905, back to the text. In late 1905, a period of radicalization, the Mensheviks came increasingly under the programmatic influence of Trotsky, dismissing the bourgeoisie as essentially counter-revolutionary and supporting a seizure of power and the setting up of a provisional revolutionary government. The revolutionary period from early 1905, in my view, demonstrated Trotsky's underlying agreement with the Bolsheviks on the most important of these programmatic questions even in 1903, as given the events of 1905 and Lenin's organizational reorientation, Trotsky found himself dragging the Menshevik faction towards the Bolsheviks' programmatic position. With the Bolsheviks and Lenin in particular forced to reassess the organizational needs of the class struggle in the light of the spontaneous evolution of the Soviet, and the Mensheviks being increasingly influenced leftward by both Trotsky and the events of 1905, the stage was set for the Unity Congress in the spring of 1906. At which the issue of factional reconciliation would be top of the agenda. Wikipedia has this to say on the Fourth Unity Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The Fourth Unity Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party took place in the old Folkets Hus in Stockholm, Sweden, from 23rd of April to 8th of May, 1906. This Congress saw the formal, albeit short-living, reconciliation between the Bolshevik and Menshevik factions, hence the word unity in the Congress's name. The Congress is attended by 112 delegates with the right to vote, who represented 57 local party organizations, and 22 delegates with voice but no vote. Other participants were delegates from various national social democratic parties, 3 each from the Social Democrats of Poland and Lithuania, the Bund, and the Latvian Social Democratic Workers' Party, 1 each from the Ukrainian Social Democratic Labor Party and the Finnish Labor Party, and also a representative of the Bulgarian Social Democratic Workers' Party. Among the Bolshevik delegates were Vladimir Lenin, Alexander Bogdanov, Leonid Krasin, Mikhail Frunze, Mikhail Kalinin, Nadezhda Krupskaya, Anatoly Lunacharsky, Fyodor Sergeyev, Stepan Shahumyan, Ivan Skvortsov-Stepanov, Joseph Stalin, Klement Voroshilov, Maxim Litvinov, and Vivi Vorovsky. The main items on the Congress agenda were the agrarian question, an appraisal of the current situation and class tasks of the proletariat, the attitude to the Duma and organizational matters. There was a bitter controversy between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks over every item. Lenin made reports and speeches on the agrarian question, the current situation, and tactics regarding the Duma elections, the armed uprising and other questions, citation needed, end bracket. The preponderance of Mensheviks at the Congress were slight, determined its character. While slight determined the Congress's character. The Congress adopted Menshevik resolutions on a number of questions, the agrarian program, the attitude to the Duma, etc. The Congress approved the first clause of the rules concerning party membership in the wording proposed by Lenin. It admitted the social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania and the Latvian Social Democratic Workers' Party into the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and determined the admission of the Bund, and predetermined the admission of the Bund, citation needed, end bracket. The Congress elected the Fourth Central Committee made up of 3 Bolsheviks and 7 Mensheviks and a Menshevik editorial board of the central body. Back to the text. The organizational relaxation of Bolshevism, the swing to the left by the Mensheviks, and the new conditions of Russian political life allowed the two factions to come together not only programmatically but also around such issues as the elective principle within the United Party. Footnote: Deutscher writes, quote, "Both Lenin and Martov now admitted that their passionate controversies had been storms in so many emigre teacups. The disputes over the prerogatives of the Central Committee and the conditions of membership had referred to the clandestine type of organization. The party had first emerged from the underground and it conducted its activities in broad daylight. For the first time, its members could vote and elect their leading bodies without fear of the Okhrana. Lenin, no less than Martov, was anxious that the committees be elected from below and not appointed from above," end quote. Isaac Deutscher, end footnote. It is important, however, to note, as indeed Lenin himself did, that some programmatic differences remain between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, even at this time of supposed unity. They included disagreements over the question of standing candidates in the Duma elections, and subsequently the attitude towards an armed uprising, and were to prove ultimately irreconcilable. Footnote: The Bolsheviks supported the use of the Duma as a platform for agitation, whilst boycotting its elections. In contrast, the Mensheviks supported the standing of candidates despite recognizing the bankruptcy of the Duma. See Lenin's article, Should We Boycott the Duma and Collected Works, Volume 10. Sorry, I'm looking at something. Wikipedia says the State Duma, also known as the Imperial Duma, was the lower house of the legislature in the Russian Empire, while the upper house was the State Council. The State Duma held its meetings in the Tauride Palace in St. Petersburg. The State Duma convened 4 times between the 27th of April 1906 and the collapse of the empire in April 1917. The first and the second Dumas were more democratic and represented a greater number of national types (clarification needed) than their successors. The third Duma was dominated by gentry, landowners, and businessmen. The fourth Duma held 5 sessions. It existed until the 2nd of March 1917 and was formally dissolved on the 6th of October 1917. Back to the text and footnote. Footnote. Some Mensheviks supported the constitutional route offered by the Duma. End footnote. Still, most important at this juncture are not the disagreements that continue to exist between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, although the importance of these differences become more relevant to this chapter in the years of reaction, as I shall demonstrate, but rather the differences which continue to exist between Trotsky and Lenin. As I have already suggested, these differences were neither organizational in form, nor were they the same issues as those which still separated Lenin from the majority of the Mensheviks. Indeed, at this time, the main issues dividing Lenin and Trotsky was essentially Trotskyist in nature. The theory of permanent revolution. It is to this theory that we must now turn. New section. Lenin, Trotsky, and the theory of permanent revolution. In order to compare and contrast the views of Lenin and Trotsky on the coming revolutionary form and its principal actors, it is necessary in the first instance to summarize those aspects of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution deemed particularly pertinent to this debate. The central importance of the theory of permanent revolution in this context is that it places the proletariat at the head of the bourgeois revolution. In the book 1905, Trotsky first recognized that the proletariat had a leadership role in the coming revolution, arguing that the proletariat would play the part played by the bourgeoisie down to 1848, given its potential for hegemony over the peasantry and the inherent weakness of the bourgeoisie. Footnote. For a full discussion on the decreasing role of the bourgeoisie and subsequent increasing importance of the proletariat in the bourgeois revolution, see Chapter 3 of Trotsky's Results and Prospects. End footnote. For Trotsky, 1905 demonstrated the potential strength of the proletariat. The potential strength of the proletariat, which would, in Trotsky's view, be fully realized in the coming upturn. Furthermore, Trotsky argued that whilst the overthrow of the proletariat and the peasantry by the bourgeoisie would limit the scope of the revolution, if the proletariat succeeded in maintaining its hegemony and broke out of national confines, then the revolution could become the prologue to a world revolution. The proletariat must in this situation enter into a process of permanent revolution in order to survive. Proletarian hegemony in the bourgeois revolution forces permanent revolution on the working class.
I'm going to read the Wikipedia on permanent revolution. Permanent revolution is the strategy of a revolutionary class pursuing its own interests independently without compromise or alliance with opposing sections of society. As a term within Marxist theory, permanent revolution was first coined by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as early as 1850. Since then, different theorists, most notably Leon Trotsky, who lived from 1879 to 1940, have used the phrase to refer to different concepts. Trotsky's permanent revolution is an explanation of how socialist revolutions could occur in societies that have not achieved an advanced capitalist mode of production. Trotsky's theory also argues that the bourgeoisie in late developing capitalist countries are incapable of developing the productive forces in such a manner as to achieve the sort of advanced capitalism which will fully develop an industrial proletariat, and that the proletariat can and must therefore seize social, economic, and political power, leading an alliance with the peasantry. Trotsky also opposed Stalin's principle of socialism in one country and stated that socialist revolutions needed to happen across the world in order to combat the global capitalist hegemony. According to Russian historian Vadim Rogovin, who lived from 1937 to 1998, the success of Stalin's theoretical position had a significant and negative impact on the entire course of the international revolutionary process. Marx's view of, quote, permanent revolution sees revolutionary activity as continuously ongoing until the revolutionary forces achieve a defined goal, such as socialism or communism. This contrasts with the permanent, that is, ongoing forever activity envisaged in Maoist continuous revolution theory or in Tom Moylan's critical utopian discourse. Marx first used the term in the phrase, quote, by substituting permanent war for permanent revolution, end quote, in the following passage from the Holy Family of published in 1844, or from 1844, in which Marx wrote that, quote, Napoleon represented the last battle of revolutionary terror against the bourgeois society. ... Napoleon perfected the terror by substituting permanent war for permanent revolution, end quote. Marx and Engels. Not Marx and Engels, Marx. Marx said that Napoleon prevented the bourgeois revolution in France from becoming fulfilled. That is, Napoleon prevented bourgeois political forces from achieving a total expression of their interests. According to Marx, Napoleon did this by suppressing the, quote, liberalism of bourgeois society, end quote, and did it because Napoleon saw, quote, the state as an end in itself, end quote, a value which supported Napoleon's, quote, political aim of conquest, end quote. Thus, he substituted, quote, permanent war for permanent revolution, end quote. However, the final two sentences show that the bourgeoisie did not give up hope, but continued to pursue their interests. For Marx, permanent revolution involves a revolutionary class, in this case the bourgeoisie, continuing to push for and achieve its interests despite the political dominance of actors with opposing interests. By 1849, Marx and Engels were able to quote the use of the phrase by other writers such as Eugen Alexis Schwanbeck, a journalist of the Kölnische Zeitung, Cologne newspaper, and Henri Drouet, suggesting that it had achieved some recognition in intellectual circles. Marx's most famous use of the phrase permanent revolution is in his March 1850 address of the Central Committee to the Communist League. Marx's audience is the proletariat in Germany, faced with the prospect that, quote, the petty bourgeois Democrats will for the moment acquire a predominant influence, end quote, i.e. temporary political power. He enjoys them as such. Quote, while the democratic petty bourgeois want to bring the revolution to an end as quickly as possible, achieving at most the aims already mentioned, it is our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent until all the more or less propertied classes have been driven from their ruling positions, until the proletariat has conquered state power, until the association of the proletarians has progressed sufficiently far, not only in one country but in all the leading countries of the world, the competition between the proletarians of these countries ceases, and at least the decisive forces of production are concentrated in the hands of the workers, end quote. In the remainder of the text, Marx outlines his proposal that the proletariat, quote, make the revolution permanent, end quote. In essence, it consists of the working class maintaining a militant and independent approach to politics both before, during, and after the struggle, which will bring the petty bourgeois Democrats to power. In an article 2 years later, Marx referred to a, quote, program of permanent revolution, of progressive taxes and death duties, and of organization of labor, end quote. This confirms the impression that Marx's theory of permanent revolution is not about revolution per se, but rather more about the attitude that a revolutionary class should adopt in the period of their political subjection, including the program of political demands they should propose. This aspect is raised in the address, as well as overtures for organizational alliance with the petty bourgeoisie. Marx is concerned about attempts to, quote, bribe the workers with a more or less disguised form of alms, and to break their revolutionary strength by temporarily rendering their situation tolerable, end quote. Therefore, the Workers' Party must use their autonomous organization to push a political program which threatens the bourgeois status quo along the following lines. 1. They can force the Democrats to make inroads into as many areas of the existing social order as possible, so as to distribute its regular functioning and so that the petty bourgeois Democrats compromise themselves. Furthermore, the workers can force the concentration of as many productive forces as possible, means of transport, factories, railways, etc., in the hands of the state. 2. They must drive the proposals of the Democrats to their logical extreme. The Democrats will in any case act in a reformist and a non-revolutionary manner and transform these proposals into direct attacks on private property. If, for instance, the petty bourgeoisie propose the purchase of the railways and factories, the workers must demand that these railways and factories simply be confiscated by the state without compensation as the property of reactionaries. The demands of the workers will thus have to be adjusted according to the measures and concessions of the Democrats. In this passage, we can see that Marx believes the proletariat should refuse to moderate its demands to the petty bourgeois consensus and advocate extensive nationalization. Furthermore, the demand of the workers should always seek to push the bourgeois further than they are prepared to go without the revolution threatening them as well. Marx concludes his address by summarizing the themes elucidated above. Quote, although the German workers cannot come to power and achieve the realization of their class interests without passing through a protracted revolutionary development, this time they can at least be certain that the first act of the approaching revolutionary drama will coincide with the direct victory of their own class in France and will thereby be accelerated. But they themselves must contribute most to their final victory by informing themselves of their own class interest, by taking up their independent political position as soon as possible, by not allowing themselves to be misled by the hypocritical phrases of the democratic petty bourgeoisie into doubting for 1 minute the necessity of an independent, organized party of the proletariat. Their battle cry must be the permanent revolution, end quote. Marx. Since Marxism emphasizes the contingency of political developments on material historical circumstances, as against idealism, it is worthwhile to have some idea of how Marx saw the context in which he advocated permanent revolution. It seems that Marx believed that, quote, the first act of the approaching revolutionary drama, in Germany, will coincide with the direct victory of their own class in France and will thereby be accelerated, end quote. That is, the petty bourgeois are expected to come to power in Germany at the same time as the direct victory of the proletariat in France. Furthermore, Marx seems to believe that the former and hence of both its, quote, imminent, parenthesis, see third paragraph of the address, end parenthesis. Therefore, Marx clearly believes that Europe is entering a time and is at a level of development of the productive forces in which the proletariat have the social revolution within the proletariat's reach. Although circumstances do not develop as anticipated, this observation proved accurate at the dawn of the 20th century, leading into the First World War and the Russian Revolution. Marx and Engels advocated permanent revolution as the permanent strategy of maintaining organizational independence along class lines and a consistently militant series of political demands and tactics. However, at no stage does Marx make the central claim with which Trotsky's conception of permanent revolution is concerned, i.e., that it is possible for a country to pass directly from the dominance of semi-feudal aristocrats who held political power in Russia in the early part of the 19th century to the dominance of the working class without an interceding period of dominance by the bourgeoisie. On the contrary, Marx's statements in his March 1850 address explicitly contradict such a view, assuming a, quote, period of petty bourgeois predominance over the classes which have been overthrown and over the proletariat, end quote. In Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky argues that this was shortened to the period between February and October 1917. Marx and Engels do not claim that socialism is impossible in one country, but they do say, quote, communists are distinguished from other working class parties by this only. 1. The national struggles of the proletarians of different countries. They point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. 2. In the various stages of development with which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interest of the movement as a whole, end quote, and acknowledge that communists, quote, are the most resolute section of the working class parties, ... and seek conquest of political power by the proletariat, end quote. Despite this, communism will likely not exist immediately after a revolution. Quote, in all probability, the proletarian revolution will transform existing society gradually and will be able to abolish private property only when the means of production are available in sufficient quantity. End quote. Engels, The Principles of Communism, Section 17 and 19. The Communist Manifesto alludes to Marx's view that the dominance of the bourgeoisie is a necessary prelude to that of the proletariat, arguing that, quote, the bourgeoisie therefore produces ... its own gravediggers, its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable, end quote. In this sense, Trotsky's version of the theory represents both a development and, to some observers, a contradiction of the expressed opinions of Marx and Engels. It must be borne in mind that for Marx, the dominance of the bourgeoisie is a prerequisite for subsequent proletarian rule holds on a world scale, as the Communist Manifesto makes clear that despite, quote, though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle, end quote. Trotsky's theory took it for granted, as did Vladimir Lenin in The State and Revolution, that the domination of the world by the bourgeoisie was complete and irreversible after the emergence of imperialism in the late 19th century. The uncertain relationship between international and national parameters in relation to class power underlies many of the disputes concerning the theory of permanent revolution. In the preface to the 1882 Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels explicitly raised the issues Trotsky would later develop. Quote, now the question is, can the Russian Obshchina, though greatly undermined, yet a form of primeval common ownership of land, pass directly to the higher form of communist common ownership? Or, on the contrary, must it first pass through the same process of dissolution, such as constitutes the historical evolution of the West? The only answer that is possible today is this. If the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so that both complement each other, the present Russian common ownership of land may serve as the starting point for a communist development, end quote. Marx and Engels. Leon Trotsky's conception of permanent revolution is based on Trotsky's understanding, drawing on the work of fellow Russian Alexander Parvus, that a Marxist analysis of events begins with the international level of development, both economic and social, National peculiarities are only an expression of contradictions in the world system. According to this perspective, the task of the bourgeois democratic revolution could not be achieved by the bourgeoisie itself in a reactionary period of world capitalism. Trotsky cites Russia as an example of this. This conception was first developed in the essays later collected in his book 1905 and in his essay Results and Prospects, and later developed in his 1929 book The Permanent Revolution. The basic idea of Trotsky's theory is that in Russia the bourgeoisie would not carry out a thorough revolution, which would institute political democracy and solve the land question. These measures were assumed to be essential to develop Russia economically. Therefore, it was argued the future revolution must be led by the proletariat, who would not only carry through the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution, but would also commence a struggle to surpass the bourgeois democratic revolution itself. How far the proletariat would be able to continue would depend upon the further course of events, and not upon the designation of the revolution as bourgeois democratic. In this sense, the revolution would be made permanent. Trotsky believed that a new workers' state would not be able to hold out against the pressures of a hostile capitalist world unless socialist revolutions quickly took hold in other countries as well. This notion later became a point of contention with the Stalinist faction within the Bolshevik Party, which held that socialism in one country could be built in the Soviet Union. Trotsky's theory was developed in opposition to the social democratic theory that undeveloped countries must pass through two distinct revolutions. First, the bourgeois democratic revolution, which socialists would assist, and at a later stage the socialist revolution with an evolutionary period of capitalist development separating those stages. This is often referred to as the theory of stages, the two-stage theory, or stagism. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks initially held to an intermediate theory. Lenin's earlier theory shared Trotsky's premise that the bourgeoisie would not complete a bourgeois revolution. Lenin thought that a democratic dictatorship of the workers and peasants could complete the tasks of the bourgeoisie. By 1917, Lenin was arguing not only that the Russian bourgeoisie would not be able to carry through the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution, and therefore the proletariat had to take state power, but also that it should take the economic power via a Soviet Workers' Council. This position was put forward to the Bolsheviks on Lenin's return to Russia in his April Theses. The first reaction of the majority of the Bolsheviks was one of rejection. Initially, only Alexander Kollontai rallied to Lenin's position within the Bolshevik Party. After the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks, now including Trotsky, did not discuss the theory of permanent revolution as such. However, its basic theses can be found in such popular outlines of communist theory as the ABC of Communism, which sought to explain the program of the Bolshevik Party by Yevgeny Preobrazhensky and Nikolai Bukharin. According to Russian historian Vadim Rogovin, the leadership of the German Communist Party had requested that Moscow send Leon Trotsky to Germany to direct the 1923 insurrection. However, this proposal was rejected by the Politburo, which was controlled by Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, who decided to send a commission of lower-ranking Russian Communist Party members. Later on, after Lenin's death in the 1920s, the theory did assume importance in the internal debates within the Bolshevik Party and was a bone of contention within the opposition to Joseph Stalin. In essence, a section of the Bolshevik Party leadership whose views were voiced at the theoretical level by Bukharin argued that socialism could be built in a single country, even an underdeveloped country like Russia. Bukharin argued that Russia's pre-existing economic base was sufficient for the task at hand, provided the Soviet Union could be militarily defended. The question of the Chinese Revolution and the subjection of the Chinese Communist Party to control by the Kuomintang at the behest of the Bolshevik Party was a topic of argument within the opposition to Stalin and the party. Figures like Karl Radek argued that a stagist strategy was correct for China. These writings were lost in the 1930s. If copies exist in the Soviet archives, they have not been located since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. By contrast, Trotsky generalized Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, which had only been previously applied to Russia. Trotsky argued that the proletariat needed to take power in a process of uninterrupted and permanent revolution in order to not only carry out the task of the bourgeois democratic revolution, but also to implement socialism. Trotsky's position was put forward in his essay entitled The Permanent Revolution, which can be found today in a single book together with results and prospects. In the Permanent Revolution essay, Trotsky generalized his theory of permanent revolution and grounded it in the idea of uneven and combined development. In contrast to the conceptions inherent within Stage's theory, the theory of uneven and combined development states that all class-based societies, including capitalist nations, develop unevenly and that some parts of these societies will develop more swiftly than others. Trotsky argued that this development is combined and that each part of the world economy is increasingly bound together with all other parts. The conception of uneven and combined development also recognizes that some areas may regress economically and socially as a result of their integration into a world economy. According to political scientist Barak Kanai Paz, Trotsky's theory of, quote, permanent revolution was grossly misrepresented by Stalin as defeatist and adventurous during the succession struggle, when in fact Trotsky encouraged revolutions in Europe, but was not at any time proposing, quote, reckless confrontations with the capitalist world. Since the assassination of Leon Trotsky in 1940, the theory of permanent revolution has been maintained by the various Trotskyist groups which have developed since then. However, the theory has been extended only modestly, if at all. While their conclusions differ, works by mainstream Trotskyist theoreticians such as Robert Chester, Joseph Hansen, Michael Louvy, and Livio Maitan related to post-war developments in Algeria, Cuba, and elsewhere. An attempt to elaborate an exception to the theory was made by Tony Cliff of the Socialist Workers' Party. In a 1963 essay, Cliff develops the idea that where the proletariat is unable to take power, a section of the intelligentsia may be able to carry out a bourgeois revolution. Cliff further argues that the use of Marxist concepts by such elements, most notably in Cuba and China, but also, for example, by regimes espousing Arab socialism or similar philosophies, is not genuine, but is the use of Marxism as an ideology of power. This reflects Cliff's view that these countries are state capitalist societies rather than deformed workers' states. Cliff's views have been criticized by more orthodox Trotskyists as an abandonment of Trotsky's theory in all but name in favor of the Stage's theory, countering that Cliff was more cautious than Trotsky about the potential of the working class in underdeveloped countries to seize power. Cliff saw such revolutions as a detour deflection on the road to socialist revolution rather than a necessary preliminary to it. Saumeyendranath Tagore, the founder of the Revolutionary Communist Party of India and an international communist leader, argued that, quote, the theory of permanent revolutionary has two aspects, one relating to the revolution of a particular country, the immediate passing over from the bourgeois democratic phase of the revolution to the socialist revolution. The second aspect is related to the international tasks of the revolution, which makes it imperative for the first victorious revolution to operate as the yeast of revolution in the world arena. Trotsky became the target of Stalin's vengeance only so far as he drew the attention of the communists throughout the world to the betrayal of the world revolution by Stalin. End quote. Tagore also argues that the theory of permanent revolution has nothing to do with Trotskyism, but is pure Marxism and Leninism. As an example, he points out that the term permanent revolution itself was coined by Marx and Engels back in 1850 in Marx and Engels' address to the Central Committee of the Communist League. According to Tagore, Lenin was just as much a champion of the permanent revolution as Trotsky was, and with a, quote, much more sure grasp of revolutionary reality, end quote. However, he argues that Trotsky, quote, certainly had done a great service to revolutionary communism by drawing out attention over and over again to the theory of permanent revolution since Lenin died in 1924 and the sinister anti-revolutionary reign of Stalin started, end quote. Tagore. In the face of what Tagore termed, quote, the next diabolical diabolical machineries of vilification and terror of Stalinocracy, end quote. Trotsky kept, quote, the banner of revolutionary communism flying in the best traditions of Marx and Lenin. Therein lies Trotsky's invaluable service to the theory of permanent revolution. So far as the theory itself is concerned, it is pure and simple revolutionary Marxism, end quote. One second. All right, so that was the Wikipedia for permanent revolution. Thank you for listening to that. Back to the text. The proletariat must in this situation enter into a process of permanent revolution in order to survive. Proletarian hegemony in the bourgeois revolution forces permanent revolution on the working class. In Results and Prospects, the book or pamphlet, Trotsky reiterated this position outlined in 1905, but went further to develop the idea that, once in power, the proletariat would neither want nor be able to limit its goals to those of the bourgeois revolution. Here Trotsky concluded that the result would be a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, supported by the peasantry, existing until the European Revolution came to the aid of Russia, enabling the proletariat to complete the proletariat's socialist tasks. Footnote. In his introduction to the German edition of the Permanent Revolution, Trotsky argued that the national dictatorship of the proletariat should be strengthened economically until the European Socialist Revolution comes to its aid. End footnote. The task of the proletariat, then, is one of permanent revolution, to push the boundaries of reform, promoting an increasingly radical program which does not stop at the bourgeois democratic stage, but it goes over to socialist measures, and in addition forces direct and immediate support in the form of a European revolution. Footnote. In his introduction to the German edition of the Permanent Revolution, Trotsky argued that the national dictatorship of the proletariat should be strengthened economically until the European Socialist Revolution comes to its aid. I don't know if I said that one already. And footnote, as illustrated in 1914 by the beginning of the Great Imperialist War. I don't know where I am, but I think I'm here. Of central importance here is Trotsky's assertion that while the revolution begins at the level of a nation, the revolution is completed, indeed can only be completed at the international level. The system of economy is a world system. There is an international division of labor and a world market which dominates national markets. Productive forces have outgrown national boundaries. National revolution can only be a link in the international chain. Whilst the question of why the theory of permanent revolution was applicable to backward countries is an interesting question, it is beyond the remit of this chapter to consider this question in any detail. Suffice it here to note that in his writings on the 1905 revolution, and indeed permanent revolution, Trotsky looked at the peculiarity of Russian historical development. Trotsky noted its, quote, comparative primitiveness and slowness, end quote. Trotsky explained this peculiar development as being a result of two major factors: the grafting on of capitalism by the state and Russia's dependence on foreign capital. What is important to the argument here are the implications that this peculiar development of Russian capitalism had for the evolution of Russian class forces. A, quote, grafted on, end quote, capitalism, which is overly dependent on foreign capital and is without organic roots, would result in a retarded and abnormal development of the bourgeoisie. It would essentially produce a bourgeoisie without culture or socio-historical roots, and thus no developed consciousness of itself as a class. Furthermore, a bourgeoisie existing under peculiar Russian conditions would, for Trotsky, do well out of the autocracy and would thus have little quarrel with it. Its revolutionary potential would therefore be hugely diminished. Moreover, the specific development of Russian, quote, capitalism would serve to create an urban working class virtually overnight. This was peculiar in a number of ways, as was demonstrated by the Russian working class, which did indeed result. This proletariat would not develop gradually, and it would be concentrated in large factories, utilizing advanced technology from the developed West. Despite its immaturity, the most important forms of production were dependent on it. Furthermore, given the size and nature of the bourgeoisie, the proletariat would enjoy a strength disproportionate to its size and age. Given this state of affairs, Trotsky was able to argue that it may well be possible for the proletariat of a backward nation like Russia to come to power sooner than that of an advanced country. In this way, then, Trotsky denied that the dictatorship of the proletariat is in some way automatically dependent on the technical development and resources of a country. Trotsky did not directly link the question of the development of the forces of production to the ability of the proletariat to assume power. He argued, quote, between the productive forces of a country and the political strength of that country's classes, there cuts across at any given moment various social and political factors of a national and international character, and these displace and even sometimes completely alter the political expression of existing economic relations, end quote. Trotsky, Results and Prospects. This indeed was for Trotsky the case with Russia. The lack of a developed politically powerful bourgeoisie and the existence of a centralized autocratic state meant that the proletariat was very powerful, the only class that could take up the revolutionary cause in Russia. However, it is crucial to note that the possibility of a proletarian dictatorship in a backward country was underpinned by the need to solve the agrarian question, a task that only the proletariat could take on successfully. Finally, before going on to contrast Trotsky's theory with the position held by Lenin, it is essential to give a brief mention to the, quote, law of uneven and combined development, end quote, on which, in an important sense, the permanent revolution rests. The law stated that as industrialization was, quote, grafted onto Russia's natural economic system rather than developing organically, old economic and social forms would not die away, resulting in the coexistence of these and new forms. Subsequently, the contradictions of uneven development would be severe. Such developmental contradictions, of course, gave rise to instability and an acceleration of social disintegration, especially given the autocracy's resistance to corresponding changes in social relations. Indeed, the state could not hold on indefinitely. However, there is another central dimension to this law. Due to the peculiar development of Russia, and in particular to Russia's use of high-level technique, the model of, quote, capitalism in Russia differed from that in, for example, Western Europe, and hence there was a strange potential for Russia to develop beyond what one would expect politically, that is, to engage in permanent revolution. For Trotsky, then, backwardness was the source of social change and upheaval, and backwardness gave rise to a peculiar revolution of backwardness. I want to read real quick the Wikipedia for combined and uneven development. Uneven and combined development, unequal and combined development, or uneven development is a concept in Marxian political economy intended to describe dynamics of human history involving the interaction of capitalist laws of motion and starting world market conditions whose national units are highly heterogeneous. The concept is used by Marxist scholars concerned with economic development. David Harvey is an advocate of the usefulness of this theory to reconstruct historical materialism on modern terms. Uneven and combined development is an accepted key concept in academic economic geography. Uneven and combined development was applied systematically by Leon Trotsky around the turn of the 20th century to the case of Russia. when Trotsky was analyzing the developmental possibilities for industrialization in the Russian Empire and the likely future of the Tsarist regime in Russia. Uneven combined development was then generalized and became the basis of Trotsky's politics of permanent revolution, which implied a rejection of the Stalinist idea that a human society inevitably develops through a unilinear sequence of necessary, quote, stages. Before Trotsky, Nikolai Chernyshevsky and Vasily Vorontsov and others proposed similar ideas. Trotsky's concept was originally inspired by a series of articles by Alexander Helpand, better known as Parvis, on the articles being titled War and Revolution in the Russian journal Iskra in 1904. At first, Trotsky intended this concept, uneven and combined development, only to describe a characteristic evolutionary pattern in the worldwide expansion of the capitalist mode of production from the 16th century onwards through the growth of a world economy which connected more and more peoples and territories together through trade, migration, and investment. His focus was initially mainly on the history of the Russian Empire, where the most advanced technological and scientific developments coexisted with extremely primitive and superstitious cultures. In the 1920s and 1930s, Trotsky increasingly generalized the concept of uneven and combined development to the whole of human history and even to processes of evolutionary biology, as well as the formation of the human personality as a general dialectical category. Uneven and combined development, the concept, played a certain role in the fierce theoretical debates during the political conflict between the supporters of Joseph Stalin and Trotsky's left opposition, a debate which ranged from the historical interpretation of the Russian Revolution and economic strategies for the transition to socialism to the correct understanding of the principles of Marxism. Bracket, citation needed, end bracket. Different countries, Trotsky observed, develop and advance to a large extent independently from each other. In ways which were quantitatively unequal, e.g. the local rate and scope of economic growth and population growth, and qualitatively different, e.g. nationally specific cultures and geographical features. In other words, countries had their own specific national history with national peculiarities. At the same time, all the different countries did not exist in complete isolation from each other. They were also interdependent parts of a world society, a larger totality, in which they all coexisted together, in which they shared many characteristics, and in which they influenced each other through processes of cultural diffusion, trade, political relations, and various, quote, spillover effects from one country to another. Bracket, citation needed, end bracket. Sociologically speaking, this had 5 main effects. A more backward, older, or more primitive country would adopt parts of the culture of a more advanced or more modern society, and a more advanced culture could also adopt or merge with parts of a more primitive culture with good or bad effects. Cultural practices, institutions, traditions, and ways of life belonging to both very old and very new epochs and phases of human history were all combined, juxtaposed, and linked together in a rather unusual way within one country. In turn, this meant that one could not really say that different societies all developed simply through the same sort of linear sequence of necessary developmental stages, but rather they could adopt/utilize the results of developments reached elsewhere without going through all the previous evolutionary stages which led up to those results. Some countries could thus skip, telescope, or, quote, compress developmental stages which other countries took hundreds of years to go through, or very rapidly carry through a modernization process that took other countries centuries to achieve. Different countries could both aid or advance the socioeconomic progress of other countries through trade, subsidies, and contributing resources, or block and break other countries as competitors from making progress by preventing the use of capital, technology, trading routes, labor, land, or other kinds of resources. In Trotsky's theory of imperialism, the domination of one country by another country does not mean that the dominated country is prevented from development altogether, but rather that the dominated country develops mainly according to the requirements of the dominated country. For example, an export industry will develop around mining and farm products in the dominated country, but the rest of the economy is not developed, so the country's economy becomes more unevenly developed than the country's economy was before, rather than achieving balanced development. Or a school system is set up with foreign assistance, but the schools teach only the messages that the dominating country wants to hear. Bracket citation needed, end bracket. The main tendencies and trends occurring at the level of world society as a whole could also be found in each separate country, where they combine with unique local trends, but this was a locally specific, quote, mix, so that some world trends asserted themselves more strongly or faster, others weaker and slower in each specific country. Thus, a country could be very advanced in some areas of activity, but at the same time comparatively retarded in other areas. One effect was that the response to the same events of world significance could be quite different in other countries because the local people attached different, quote, weightings to experiences and therefore drew different conclusions. According to Trotsky, the unequal and combined development of different countries had an effect on the class structure of society. Bracket citation needed, end bracket. For example, the Russian Empire in 1917 was largely a peasant society composed of many different nationalities and governed by an absolutist state headed by the Tsar. Popular democracy did not exist. A process of industrialization had begun in the main cities since Peter the Great. For example, the Putilov Steel Works established in Petrograd, where the February 1917 revolution began with a strike, was the largest in the world at the time. But this urban industrialization process relied mainly on the investment of foreign capital from France, Britain, and other countries and was limited to some urban areas and regions. The Russian bourgeoisie, which developed under the tutelage of the Tsarist state, lacked much power and was politically weak. The bourgeoisie was unable to establish political democracy. At the same time, a militant industrial working class developed in the main cities, concentrated in large factories and plants. Bracket citation needed, end bracket. In this way, the archaic structure of primitive peasant production and a semi-feudal state combined with the culture of modern industrial society. Trotsky believed that this would shape the unique character of the Russian Revolution. Namely, the Russian bourgeoisie was politically too weak and too dependent on the Tsarist state to challenge its autocratic rule, and therefore the revolution against Tsarist rule would be spearheaded by the revolt of urban workers. Thus, the political and modernizing tasks normally associated in Europe with the leadership of the rising bourgeoisie, such as fighting for popular democracy and civil rights against absolutism, land ownership reform, industrializing the country, and national self-determination for oppressed nationalities, would have to be carried out in the Russian Empire under the leadership of working-class parties, in particular the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which had been outlawed, although there were several other socialist, nationalist, and liberal parties. In the chaos towards the end of the First World War, in which Russian soldiers fought against the Imperial German Army, this political assessment proved largely correct. The provisional government established by the February Revolution in 1917 collapsed, and the October Revolution, in which the Russian Marxists played a dominant role, destroyed Tsarist state power completely. Thereafter, the Russian bourgeoisie was largely expropriated. Most businesses then fell under state ownership. A new stage in Trotsky's understanding of uneven and combined development in world history was reached in his analysis of fascism and populism in France, Spain, and Italy. Trotsky makes it clear that human progress is not a linear, continuously advancing process of bourgeois modernization. Progress can also be reversed or undone, and ancient cults, superstitions, or barbarous traditions can be revived, even though nobody previously thought that was possible. Around the time that Trotsky settled in Vienna as a journalist in exile after escaping from Siberia a second time, the Austro-Marxist Rudolf Hilferding wrote his famous book Finance Capital, first published in 1910, in which Hilferding mentions an idea very similar to Trotsky's. The passage occurs in chapter 22 on, quote, the export of capital and the struggle for economic territory, end quote. It has never been proved whether Hilferding was influenced in any way by what Trotsky had written, although it is known they corresponded with each other. But Hilferding's own analysis of, quote, the latest phase of capitalist development, end quote, certainly influenced a whole generation of socialist leaders. In any case, similar notions were widespread among socialists throughout Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe at this time. Among other things, Hilferding states, quote, the export of capital, especially since capital is assumed the form of industrial and finance capital, has enormously accelerated the overthrow of all the old social relations and the involvement of the whole world in capitalism. Capitalist development did not take place independently in each individual country, but instead capitalist relations of production and exploitation were imported along with capital from abroad, and indeed imported at the level already attained in the most advanced country. Just as a newly established industry does not yet develop from handicraft beginnings and techniques into a modern giant concern, but is established from the outset as an advanced capitalist enterprise, so capitalism is now imported into a new country in capitalism's most advanced form and exerts capitalism's revolutionary effects far more strongly in a much shorter time than was the case, for instance, in the capitalist development of Holland and England. End quote, Rudolf Hilferding. Hilferding's insight was rarely noticed by English-speaking Marxists. Hilferding's book, Finance Capital, which went out of print several times, was never translated into English until 1981. Wow. i.e. 70 years later. After the publication of Lenin's classic interpretation of imperialism as the highest and final stage of capitalism in 1917, most Marxist writers based their analyses of imperialism on Lenin's book, even though on several occasions throughout the book Lenin cites Hilferding approvingly. By the time that Hilferding became finance minister in Germany in 1923, the Leninists regarded Rudolf Hilferding as a reformist renegade, and Hilferding's analyses were no longer trusted or taken seriously. The idea of uneven and combined development is formulated by Trotsky as well as Lenin's, quote, law of uneven economic and political development under capitalism are still being used today, especially in academic studies of international relations, archaeology, anthropology, and development economics, as well as in discussions of the Trotskyist movement. Such international relations schools as the world systems theory and dependency theory have been both influenced by imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, by Lenin, and Trotsky's writings on the subject. The 2015 book, How the West Came to Rule, The Geopolitical Origins of Capitalism, attempts to use the theory as part of a non-Eurocentric account of the development of capitalism. Geography has produced influential scholarship on the idea of uneven development. Geography started to lean left politically before the 1970s, resulting in a particular interest in questions of inequality and uneven development. Uneven development has since become somewhat of a homegrown theory in geography, as geographers have worked to explain what causes inequality within different scales of space, locally, nationally, and internationally. Key scholars in this field include Doreen Massey, Neil Smith, and David Harvey. Uneven development results from the, quote, spatially and temporally uneven processes and outcomes that are characteristic and functional to capitalism, end quote. Much of neoclassical economic theory holds that features of unevenness such as income inequality equalizes as a result of capital diffusion throughout the open market. Proponents argue that investment liberalization allows foreign capital to invest in capital-poor countries, yielding the highest rate of return, and that global integration promotes competitive advantage. Neoclassical theory contends that newly globalized, liberalized, and capitalized developing countries have the added advantage over developed countries in that they are able to draw on existing markets, capital flow regimes, and technologies. This has the effect of placing all countries on an even playing field. The result is a global economy in equilibrium, or in other words, convergence. As such, in the neoclassical view, uneven development is merely an interim stage of economic development that can be erased by the free market. Marxist geographers, on the other hand, assert that uneven development is persistently produced and reproduced by capital diffusion, and therefore is an inherent and permanent feature of capitalism. Unlike the neoliberal contention of the erasure of disparities between convergence, Marxists maintain that a capital accumulation depends on different economic climates for its regeneration. Harvey states that accumulation, quote, is the engine which powers growth under the capitalist mode of production. The capitalist system is therefore highly dynamic and inevitably expansionary, end quote. Harvey. The dynamism of capitalism is due to capitalism's persistent search for competitive advantage and consequently capitalism's movement away from oversaturated economies towards new spaces from which capital can extract greater profit. For instance, developed economies are characterized by high land rents and wages and unionized labor, translating into high costs of production and lower gains. By contrast, developing economies have abundant pliable labor and low rents and wages. As such, it is favorable for capital investments to move into the latter economy from the former in the interest of gaining greater rates of return. Keeley argues that capital diffusion throughout the global market remains a highly uneven process marked by reversals of comparative advantage and by cycles of investment and disinvestment, having the effect of elevating some spaces while simultaneously marginalizing other spaces. Differential economic environments have material effects on the ground. Processes of capital accumulation through space and time create new geographic landscapes shaped by crisis. Deindustrialization and capital flight on the one hand, and influxes of capital and industrialization on the other. Capitalism not only reshuffles core periphery relations, but rather, as Neil Smith claims, capitalism also penetrates all geographic scales. At the urban scale, different rent gaps trigger investment and disinvestment in particular neighborhoods, driving gentrification. On the global scale, integrated economies provoke time-space compression, enabling enhanced communication and capital mobility. Smith argues that the subsequent erosion of the nation's scale as the primary agent created a pivotal link between the global and urban scales. Since the 1990s, the increasingly integrated global economy has given greater importance to the role of the city. Indeed, world city building has become the geographical force of capitalism. New spaces of accumulation in Asia, Latin America, and Africa are gaining competitive advantage as new centers of command and control of surplus capital. Other elements of neoliberal thought, such as reducing the, quote, left arm, end quote, of the state, including welfare and support for the poor, create even bigger inequalities between residents of the same areas, also resulting in uneven development. Marxist historian Tom Nairn has argued that uneven development can also lead to peripheral nationalism. For example, in Scotland, peripheral regions tend to promote nationalist movements when regional inequalities overlap with ethnic differences, or when membership of a large state no longer presents advantages. In underdeveloped regions, nationalist movements mobilize the population against the persistence of ethnic economic inequality. Helena Norberg Hodge is an economist who spent more than 30 years in Ladakh. Helena Norberg Hodge argues that uneven development and crises often affect people now because of past economic activities. To solve the problem, the fundamental economic approach needs change from, quote, globalizing to, quote, localizing. Localization can contribute to reduce CO2 emissions, solve the economic problems, and restore biodiversity as well as cultural diversity. Localizing is one of the ways to secure jobs in global population. Norberg Hodge based her argument on her experience of witnessing changes in Ladakh before and after the region was subsidized to enhance economic activities and promote development. The subsidies meant that products from thousands of miles away could be sold cheaper than locally made products, which restricted the local market. It quickly led to unemployment and religious strife. Norberg Hodge raised critical questions about the effects of spending on infrastructure, such as roads intended to stimulate the economy and reduce costs in order to achieve greater social well-being. The point is, that the globalized economy enables people to control other places from a far distance without knowing the situation in the region. Large investments subsidizing the transportation system make products from thousands of miles away cheaper than locally made products. Rather than improving the local community, the local market collapses and local people lose their jobs, while investors far away make a lot of profit for business ventures that create more unequal development than there was before. Okay, so thank you for listening to that. That was the Wikipedia for uneven and combined development. I know that's was kind of long and perhaps tedious to listen to, but I felt it necessary to indulge. New section: Lenin and the Russian Revolution. How does this position compare with that of Lenin? It is clear that due to the retarded development of the bourgeoisie and its alliance with the autocracy, Lenin saw the possibility of the peasantry and the proletariat potentially forging an alliance against the autocracy. Trotsky, of course, agreed with this formulation. However, the two disagreed over both the nature of that alliance and the political conclusions that one could draw. Trotsky emphasized the heterogeneity of the peasantry, isolated in rural localities away from the towns, and subsequently suffering from localism and disorganization. Hence, Trotsky drew the conclusion that, as a social group, it was incapable of being a leading force in the coming revolution, as the history of all revolutions had shown. Rather, the peasantry had a great, indeed vital, supporting role to the proletariat's hegemonic role, and the latter would widen its social base to the peasantry in order to consolidate its power. In contrast, Lenin was more optimistic about the possibility of an independent peasant party. Lenin believed that if the peasants were drawn into the political struggle, the peasants could be politicized, form a peasant union, the embryo of a peasant party, and participate in the Soviet. Despite his optimism, though, Lenin, like Trotsky, did not believe that the peasantry itself could attain a hegemonic role in the revolution. Footnote: Lenin wrote that, quote, the peasantry in the mass tends to come under the leadership of the Revolutionary and Republican Party, end quote. Lenin, in Two Tactics of Social Democracy and the Democratic Revolution, Collected Works, Volume 9. Sorry, I was looking up something. Anyway, back to the text. End footnote. However, Lenin did insist that the dictatorship of the proletarian peasantry represented the victory of the peasantry led by the proletariat. Footnote: see Lenin's The Historical Meaning of the Inter-Party Struggle in Russia in Collected Works, Volume 16. End footnote. Herein lies the essential difference between Lenin and Trotsky. Whilst Lenin saw the peasantry, led by the proletariat, coming to power for the achievement of the minimum program, and then retreating into opposition against the bourgeoisie, Trotsky insisted that the proletariat supported by the peasantry must itself take power and push the boundaries of reform to achieve socialism itself, though in the context of a European revolutionary upheaval. Footnote: the minimum program consisted of pushing the bourgeois revolution to the bourgeois revolution's limits, thus achieving the maximum freedom possible within the bourgeois framework. End footnote. Insofar as Lenin expected the proletariat and the peasantry voluntarily to relinquish power, having achieved the minimum program, Trotsky, in my view, correctly dismissed Lenin's position as nonsense. Trotsky thus made the distinction between Lenin's, quote, dictatorship of the peasantry and the proletariat, and his own, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat supported by the peasantry, end quote. Essentially, then, Lenin made the mistake of accepting the two-stage revolutionary scheme as relevant to the Russian situation. One second. I want to read the Wikipedia real quick on two-stage theory. The two-stage theory, or stagism, is a Marxist-Leninist political theory which argues that underdeveloped countries such as Tsarist Russia must first pass through a stage of capitalism via a bourgeois revolution before moving to a socialist stage. Stagism was applied to countries worldwide that had not passed through the capitalist stage. In the Soviet Union, this two-stage theory was opposed by the Trotskyist theory of permanent revolution. While the discussion on stagism focuses on the Russian Revolution, Maoist theories such as New Democracy tend to apply a two-stage theory to struggles elsewhere. In Marxist-Leninist theory under Joseph Stalin, the theory of two stages gained a revival. More recently, the South African Communist Party and the Socialist Alliance have re-elaborated the two-stage theory, although the Socialist Alliance differentiates their position from the Stalinist position. The two-stage theory is often attributed to Marx and Engels, but critics such as David McClellan and others dispute that they envisage the strict application of this theory outside of the actually existing Western development of capitalism, citation needed, end bracket. Although all agree that Marx and Engels argue that Western capitalism provides the technological advances necessary for socialism and the, quote, gravediggers, end quote, of the capitalist class in the form of the working class, critics of the two-stage theory, including most trends of Trotskyism, counter that Marx and Engels deny that they had laid down a formula to be applied to all countries in all circumstances. McClellan and others cite Marx's reply to Mikhailovsky. Quote, Mikhailovsky feels he absolutely must metamorphose my historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historico-philosophic theory of the general path every people is fated to tread, whatever the historical circumstances in which it finds itself, ... But I beg Mikhailovsky's pardon, he is both honoring and shaming me too much, end quote, Karl Marx replied to Mikhailovsky. In the preface to the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto of 1882, Marx and Engels specifically outline an alternative path to socialism for Russia. In Russia, the Mensheviks believed the two-stage theory applied to Tsarist Russia. The Mensheviks were criticized by Leon Trotsky in what became the theory of permanent revolution in 1905. Later, when the two-stage theory reappeared in the Soviet Union after the death of Vladimir Lenin, the theory of permanent revolution was supported by the left opposition. The permanent revolution theory argues that the tasks allotted in the two-stage theory to the capitalist class can only be carried out by the working class with the support of the poor peasantry, and that the working class will then pass on to the socialist tasks and expropriate the capitalist class. However, the revolution cannot pause here and must remain permanent in the sense that the revolution must seek worldwide revolution to avoid isolation and move towards international socialism. Citation needed, end bracket. Back to the text. However, whilst Lenin's rejection of permanent revolution appeared to be complete in April 1905 when Lenin wrote, quote, a too rapid transition to the maximum program is simply absurd, end quote, it is clearly not that straightforward. Footnote, see Lenin's The Revolutionary Democratic Dictatorship of the Proletariat and Peasantry in the Collected Works, Volume 8, end footnote. Even at this time, Lenin was prepared to concede that it was possible to, quote, make the Russian political revolution the prelude to the socialist revolution in Europe, end quote. Lenin, also in The Revolutionary Democratic Dictatorship of the Proletariat and Peasantry in Collected Works, Volume 8. End footnote. Thus, Lenin implied an acceptance of the view that the transition period between the two revolutions could potentially be shortened. Moreover, at the end of 1905, Lenin argued that the counter-revolution may be threatened by the awakening of the European proletariat, which may come to Russia's assistance by preparing for the socialist revolution. Footnote. See Lenin's The Stages, the Trends, and the Prospects of Revolution in Collected Works, Volume 10. End footnote. Indeed, whilst writing on the land question in the same period, Lenin argued that one could not have a definite plan regarding this issue as a number of scenarios may present themselves, and Lenin was clear that the ultimate aim was, quote, uninterrupted revolution, end quote. Footnote. See Lenin's Social Democracy's Attitude to the Peasant Movement in the Collected Works, Volume 9. End footnote. We can see then that whilst Lenin essentially rejected permanent revolution and permanent revolution's inherently internationalist stance, the seeds of Lenin's acceptance of this theory appear already to be visible. At the very least, it would appear that Lenin considered there to be enough common ground between Lenin's self and Trotsky on the nature of the coming revolution and the coming revolution's primary actors to see a potential for cooperation. Footnote. Deutscher writes, quote, Lenin twice emphatically acknowledged that in advocating an alliance of workers and peasants, Trotsky was on common ground with the Bolsheviks, end quote. Isaac Deutscher, end footnote. So far, it has been argued here that the differences between Lenin and Trotsky on the organizational question effectively disappeared as Lenin reevaluated his position in the wake of the 1905 revolution. However, the two were still destined for separation as during this period a new point of departure developed regarding the nature of the coming revolution and the coming revolution's primary actors. Whilst Lenin appeared to be somewhat open to the ideas presented by Trotsky in his theory insofar as he shared his pessimism regarding the bourgeoisie and viewed the proletariat as the hegemonic class in the coming revolution, he was not to be entirely convinced of the theory per se until early 1917. Indeed, as will now be demonstrated, the division between Lenin and Trotsky was unfortunately to be accentuated in the period of reaction, during which the irreconcilable split between the Menshevik and Bolshevik factions would lead the two revolutionaries to differ on a much more important issue, that of conciliationism. New section, Reaction, Disintegration, and Division. The conciliatory years of social democracy, characterized not least by the Unity Congress in 1906, were to be short-lived. By mid-1907, the period of reaction had set in. Repression increasingly began to displace the newfound freedoms of the upturn, with Stolypin effectively restoring the autocratic conditions of past years and overseeing a new reign of terror. The Second Duma was dissolved in July 1907 by Stolypin, who then introduced a new electoral law, drastically restricting the suffrage, disenfranchising even many of the liberals, and hence rendering the Third Duma something of a more moderate, right-liberal affair. Having originally been a proponent of reform, Stolypin had attempted to disarm the populace and then introduce controlled political and social reform from above, including an insurance scheme for workers, increased civil rights, and access to education and a local government, Zemstvo expansion, with the support of the liberal Guchkov. Wikipedia says Alexander Guchkov lived from 1862 to 1936 and was a Russian politician, chairman of the Third Duma and Minister of War in the Russian Provisional Government. Back to the text. However, Stolypin did not have a free hand with which to implement these reforms, managing only to implement his agricultural reforms of 1906 and 1910, whilst falling short in all other areas in the face of severe programmatic restrictions enforced by the upper house, led by Durnovo. One second. Wikipedia says the State Council was the supreme state advisory board to the Tsar in the Russian Empire. From 1906, the State Council was the upper house of the parliament under the Russian Constitution of 1906. And this Durnovo, according to Wikipedia, is Peter Nikolaevich Durnovo, who lived from 1845 to 1915. Peter Nikolaevich Durnovo was an Imperial Russian lawyer, politician, and member of Russian nobility, belonged to the House of Durnovo, known by anti-Tsarist revolutionaries in the era of the Russian Revolution of 1905 as the, quote, counter-revolution's butcher, end quote. Back to the text. This period was marked by increasing levels of suppression and the restriction of freedoms, which culminated in the assassination of Stolypin in 1911. I did not know that Stolypin was assassinated, and thus the end of liberal government cooperation for good. The Fourth Duma was doomed to be even more conservative than its predecessor, and indeed took Russia into the First World War. The effects of the period of reaction on the class struggle and, in particular, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party were significant. The Russian-based leadership of the movement effectively disintegrated, with many of its members going into exile. Footnote: Lenin himself left Russia at the end of December 1907. End footnote. In addition, many of the bourgeois intellectuals left the party in a disheartened state. Footnote: see Antonio Carlo's Lenin on the Party. End footnote. Moreover, the membership of both the Bolshevik and the Menshevik factions suffered considerably as a result of the downturn and, more specifically, class demoralization. Footnote: Cliff is incorrect to refer to the party as a mass party throughout the collapse of 1907 of the social democratic movement being a good example of how the party did not consistently warrant this label. In applying this label indiscriminately, Tony Cliff downplays the evolution of Lenin's organizational position and the effects of objective and subjective conditions on the state of the party. End footnote. In terms of local committees, there was a rapid decrease in their functioning and crippled by the stagnation, retreat, and then near collapse of the revolutionary movement. The party was unable to hold a congress in the years immediately after 1907. It was the Mensheviks who suffered the most severe disintegration, this being reflected in their organizational and tactical stance during the period that followed. However, the Bolsheviks too were not without their problems, with the force of circumstances causing internal divisions. The period of 1907 to 12, then, was characterized by, on the one hand, the Bolshevik struggle against the new right-oriented Mensheviks, and on the other, the struggle of the Leninist section of the Bolsheviks against Bogdanov, who was expelled from the party in 1909. The latter of these two struggles is not of great concern in this context. In contrast, however, the struggle between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks represented a resurrection of old feuds, and essential to the changing relationship between Lenin and Trotsky. In 1903, there was clearly a general agreement between social democrats on the need for the party to form alliances with the democratic liberals, whilst at one and the same time educating the masses about their specific class interest. However, by the end of 1904, as the liberals established themselves as an increasingly powerful political force, a divergence of the Menshevik and the Bolshevik positions became ever more apparent, with the Bolsheviks increasingly viewing the Zemstvo campaign as essentially counter-revolutionary. In this way, the divisions of 1903, principally around organizational issues, had widened to incorporate the contentious issue of the nature and the extent of class alliances in the coming revolution. The events of 1905, of course, convinced Lenin further of the essentially counter-revolutionary credentials of the liberals, although Lenin did separate the petit bourgeois section from the liberal monarchist section of the bourgeoisie, arguing that only the former possessed democratic aspirations. Footnote. Here we can see the beginning of Lenin's proletariat peasantry alliance in the form of the democratic dictatorship. End footnote. So, whilst the two factions of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party were drawn together through the struggles of 1905, they remained latently but inherently separated by their attitudes to liberal class alliances. Thus, as soon as the period of upturn waned, the fragile unity was displaced by heated controversies over such issues as participation in the Duma, the potential for a future revolutionary upsurge, and the nature of its leadership. It was these tactical differences which emerged between the two factions that underpinned the new organizational disputes that characterized the period of 1907 to 1912. Footnote. See Lenin on Bolshevism, Collected Works, Volume 18. End footnote. The Mensheviks, suffering a rapid decrease in membership, believed the revolutionary upsurge to be defeated, but balked at the idea of returning to the underground. The Mensheviks seized upon the opportunities still remaining for a degree of legal work, and thus called for a commitment to an open party form. Footnote. It is important to note that for many of the Mensheviks, the party in its old form had been destroyed in the wake of Tsarist repression. Hence, the fact that there was no longer a real party in the shape of an integral organized hierarchy was sufficient grounds for those, such as Potrasov, to deny the charge of, quote, liquidationism. Parenthesis. Petrasov, writing in Nasha Zarya, number 2, 1910, quoted by Lenin in his paper, Controversial Issues, an Open Party in the Marxists. End footnote. This was the position of the Menshevik majority, a position which was to be strongly contested by the Bolsheviks, especially Lenin, who viewed such a stance as essentially bourgeois. Footnote. This charge of reformism and bourgeois collaboration was seen by Lenin to be supported by the Menshevik position regarding participation in the Second Duma. End footnote. Indeed, Lenin argued that in rejecting the need for a clandestine party nucleus and illegal activities, the liquidationists were in effect rejecting the resolutions of December 1908 on tactics and organization and the decisions made at the plenary meeting of January 1910. I want to read the Wikipedia for liquidationism real quick. In Leninist theory, liquidationism is the ideological abandonment, liquidation of the vanguard party's program, either in whole or in part, by party members. According to the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, writing in 1909, liquidationism, quote, consists ideologically in negation of the revolutionary class struggle of the socialist proletariat in general and the denial of the hegemony of the proletariat, end quote. Vladimir Lenin. Nikolai Alexandrovich Rajkov was identified by Lenin as a liquidationist. In his concluding remarks in the 1914 Marxism and Liquidationism Symposium, Lenin made the distinction between, quote, left liquidationism, which is, quote, leaning towards anarchism, and, quote, right liquidationism, which is, quote, liquidationism proper, and, quote, leans towards liberalism, end quote. The term is still used in modern ideological discussions of the communist left. Back to the text. The liquidationists were conflating the need for legal work with the need for legal organizational form. Footnote: Lenin, The Illegal Party and Legal Work in Collected Works, Volume 18. End footnote. Moreover, Lenin argued that to dissolve the illegal party nucleus was to diminish the revolutionary vanguard, and thus force the movement to rely increasingly on reformism, a completely unacceptable proposal. In contrast, Lenin argued for a combination of legal and illegal work, the consolidation of a clandestine party nucleus as a stable center in the period of downturn, as indeed did Trotsky. Footnote: see Lenin's resolution of the Conference of the Extended Editorial Board of Proletariat. End footnote. Footnote: Paul LeBlanc cites Trotsky's article in his Pravda as proof of his support for Lenin's position, that is, a combination of legal open work and a clandestine illegal party nucleus. See Paul LeBlanc's book, Lenin and the Revolutionary Party. End footnote. Sorry, I'm looking up this book by Paul LeBlanc, Lenin and the Revolutionary Party. It was republished by Haymarket. And it says, for generations, historians of the right, left, and center have all debated the best way to understand V.I. Lenin's role in shaping the Bolshevik Party in the years leading up to the Russian Revolution. At their worst, these studies locate Lenin's influence in the forcefulness of his personality. At their best, they show how Lenin moved other Bolsheviks through patient argument and political debate. Yet remarkably few have attempted to document the ways Lenin's ideas changed or how they were in turn shaped by the party Lenin played such a central role in building. In this thorough, concise, and accessible introduction to Lenin's theory and practice of revolutionary politics, Paul LeBlanc gives a vibrant sense of the historical context of the socialist movement in Russia and abroad, from which Lenin's ideas about revolutionary organizations spring. What emerges from LeBlanc's partisan yet measured account is an image of a collaborative, ever-adaptive, and dynamically engaged network of revolutionary activists who form the core of the Bolshevik Party. Back to the text, end footnote. Clearly, Lenin did not view this stance as representing a return to the pre-1905 party form, as Lenin considered that since that period the links between the underground party and the masses had greatly improved as a result of the upturn characterized by the revolution. Footnote: see Lenin's To the Social Democrats in Collected Works, Volume 18. End footnote. Lenin thus called for a systematic exposure of liquidationism and liquidationism's organizational separation from the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. In Lenin's introduction to the pamphlet, Two Parties, Lenin took Kamenev's line, arguing that the liquidators represented a different movement, separate from the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, aiming to displace the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party with a legally existing federation, or as Lenin termed it, a, quote, Stolypin Labor Party, end quote. Footnote: see Lenin's article, resolution adopted by the Second Paris Group of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party on the state of affairs in the party. End footnote. These events in the formation of the Bolshevik program in Prague in 1912 represented the culmination of a series of programmatic divisions which developed rapidly in this period. How did this difficult period of repression and subsequent political division, which appeared to take the form of an organizational disagreement, but in reality was merely a symptom of the underlying programmatic divisions which existed between the two factions, affect the relationship between Lenin and Trotsky? It has already been demonstrated that Lenin and Trotsky not only shared the view that a clandestine party nucleus, supplemented by legal activities, was the way forward for the party, but also that they were of a similar opinion on many tactical questions. Furthermore, it is clear that Trotsky played no part in the Duma participation debate within the Bolshevik faction. However, despite this, Lenin increasingly attacked Trotsky during this period. Now, whilst Lenin did indeed disagree with Trotsky on the theory of permanent revolution, Lenin had done so since 1906 without having to attack Trotsky to such an extreme degree. Moreover, I have demonstrated that there are differences on the nature of the coming revolution were in fact insufficient to keep them irreconcilably divided, especially given their agreement on the need for a proletarian-led revolution. There must therefore be an added dimension outside of their differences in respect of permanent revolution. Of course, it has been widely argued that the organizational question remained a contentious issue between the two right down to 1917. However, it has also been shown here that the revolutionary events of 1905 essentially resolved the organizational divisions which had dominated the 1903 Congress. Whilst it could be argued that the period of reaction had forced a degree of change in Lenin's thinking and party practices, it must be recognized that the period of 1912 to 14 saw a renewed period of struggle and an accompanying relaxation of the Bolshevik Party once more, with an increased utilization of legal channels of resistance, strikes, political mobilizations, and so on. Furthermore, Trotsky himself had come to realize through the experience of 1905 that the Democratic Mass Party, in its perfect form, could not be achieved under autocratic conditions, especially in periods of extreme downturn in the class struggle. Footnote. See Trotsky's In Defense of the Party. Footnote. Liebman argues quite convincingly that the return to objective conditions of repression resulted in an increasing imposition of the party, a decrease in the rights of minority groups, and a partial reversion to the pre-1905 organizational form insofar as the party once again became small, centralized, and disciplined, with an emphasis on the merits of organization in and of itself, and an increase in the strength of the central institutions over autonomous local committees. End footnote. Back to the end footnote. Moreover, whilst concerned to minimize the influence and control of the committee men, there is no evidence to suggest that Trotsky remained other than relatively confident that come the, quote, fresh political upturn, end quote, the remaining excesses of Bolshevism would be smoothed out. Footnote. Cliff argues that the aim of Trotsky's Pravda was in part to break the influence of the committee men in the Bolshevik faction. End footnote. Footnote. See Leon Trotsky in Defense of the Party. End footnote. It appears to be the case that whilst the objective conditions of Russian society throughout this period forced a partial return to old party ways, this was offset to some degree by the upturn in the class struggle in 1912 and remained only a marginal issue in terms of Trotsky's relationship with Lenin at this juncture. Hence, having rejected both the organizational issue and the question of permanent revolution as the main force behind Lenin's polemic, we are still left with the question of what exactly led Lenin to instigate a vicious polemic against Trotsky. In order to answer this question, one must look at the context in which the polemic took place. That is, the irreconcilable splitting of the Menshevik and Bolshevik factions. Clearly, the principal point of departure between Lenin and Trotsky in this period was their different stances with regard to the Mensheviks. It has already been argued above that Lenin took an unequivocal stand towards the Mensheviks regarding their rejection of revolutionary tactics. Lenin saw the battle for unity as totally lost, and thus sought to consolidate the Bolshevik wing of the Revolutionary Party, writing off the Mensheviks once and for all. Trotsky, on the other hand, whilst in no way supporting the liquidationism of the Mensheviks, still believed it was possible to work with both factions of the party. Trotsky sought to play down their differences, seeing the differences as purely technical difficulties that could be overcome so that unity could be established. At the very least, Trotsky did not want to break all ties with the Mensheviks, as Trotsky still believed that a new upturn would unite the two factions in actions as had been the case in 1905. Trotsky had not yet accepted the bankruptcy of Menshevism, as Lenin had, and indeed would not do so until the beginning of the First World War. For Lenin, then, this conciliationism demonstrated Trotsky's lack of understanding with regard to the tactical differences between Bolshevism and Menshevism. Footnote: see Lenin's Disruption of Unity under cover of Unity. End footnote. That's in Lenin's Collected Works, Volume 20. End footnote. In my view, Lenin was actually correct on this issue. It would seem logically to be the case that an essentially reformist group has no real points of contact with a revolutionary group. Indeed, to a large extent, both the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks appear to accept this split as unavoidable. However, Trotsky still saw room for cooperation. In essence, Trotsky did not seem fully to appreciate the programmatic differences between the two groups, and if Trotsky did, failed to attribute significant importance to these differences in terms of the potential for united action. Therefore, Trotsky was to remain separated from Lenin principally over the issue of conciliationism and, perhaps of less importance, the issue of permanent revolution. The result was an intense polemical battle between the two, so severe that they appeared to be further from each other than they had ever looked before, with Lenin, in particular, exaggerating the problem of permanent revolution perhaps beyond the level necessary, and blinding Lenin's self to the weakness of Lenin's own position, that is, Lenin's advocacy of the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. Footnote: for example, Lenin described Trotsky's permanent revolution as, quote, absurdly left, end quote. See Lenin's article Disruption of Unity under the cover of Unity in Collected Works, Volume 20. Note also that, in my view, Carlo is overstating the division between Lenin and Trotsky regarding permanent revolution and the nature of the revolutionary dictatorship. End footnote. New section, Preparing the Ground for Unity. It has been argued that the principal division between Lenin and Trotsky in the run-up to the 1905 revolution was one of organization. Whilst this particular issue was resolved during the period of revolutionary upheaval, other non-organizational conflicts were developed between Lenin and Trotsky, most significantly over the issue of conciliationism and the theory of permanent revolution, with the theory of permanent revolution's inherent internationalism. How were these contentious issues resolved in the run-up to 1917? The period of 1912 to 1914 saw an increase in working-class activity after the prolonged downturn of 1907. Whilst this upturn threatened to strengthen social democracy in Russia, the declaration of war in 1914 and the subsequent rise of social patriotism, characterized by the abandonment of internationalism, threatened the very foundation of that social democratic movement. The development of this tendency had a profound effect on Lenin, who made it his overriding concern to break social patriotism and to distance the Bolsheviks from the Second Internationalists who supported this chauvinist position. It was in this context that Lenin was finally to realize that the fate of Russia was intrinsically linked with developments in Europe. He thus abandoned his earlier position as laid out in two tactics, writing, quote, "The task confronting the proletariat of Russia is the consummation of the bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia in order to kindle the socialist revolution in Europe," end quote. Footnote: see Lenin's Several Theses in Lenin's Collected Works, Volume 21. End footnote. Lenin's reorientation with regard to this issue did, of course, have serious implications for his two-stage revolutionary schema. If the fate of Russia was indeed linked to the coming international socialist revolution, insofar as events in Russia could ignite socialist revolution elsewhere, and Russia itself was part of the world system, it was quite possible for the Russian revolutionary upheaval to overstep the boundaries of the bourgeois revolution. Footnote. Note that Lenin did not believe that Russia could lead the socialist revolution. End footnote. Indeed, for Lenin, natural societal development acting alongside the new conditions of imperialist war could lead to a general socialization of production, which would enhance the international socialist development. What is important is that the role of the European proletariat now became central to Lenin's analysis. Footnote. See Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism in Collected Works, Volume 22. See also, end footnote. Footnote. See Lenin, Meeting of the Central Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Bolshevik, in Collected Works, Volume 26. End footnote. Robert Daniels notes the importance of Lenin's internationalist reorientation when Robert Daniels highlights how many, quote, leftists returned to the Bolshevik fold around the issue of internationalism during this period, and especially at the Bolsheviks' Sixth Congress. I'm going to read the Wikipedia real quick for the Bolsheviks' Sixth Congress. The Sixth Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Bolsheviks, was held during the 26th of July to the 3rd of August, 1917 in Petrograd, Russia. The Sixth Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Bolsheviks, elected the Sixth Central Committee. This is the first Congress of the Bolsheviks following their 1912 split from the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The previous Fifth Congress in 1907 was the last Congress of the United Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, with both Bolsheviks and Mensheviks attending. The Mensheviks held their own Congress a few weeks later, also in Petrograd. Because during the Congress, Vladimir Lenin and Grigory Zinoviev were in hiding, the Congress was led by Joseph Stalin and Yakov Sverdlov, as was its speaker. Lenin, Zinoviev, Trotsky, Kamenev, Kollontai, and Lunacharsky, who were in hiding or in prison, were elected in absentia to the honorary presidium of the Congress. Held semi-legally in between the February Revolution and the October Revolution, this was the first Congress to take place in Russia since the initial Congress and the last not to be held in Moscow. The party merged with the Mezryansky. End footnote. Or not end footnote, back to the text. Footnote, see R.V. Daniels, The Conscience of the Revolution. I have a couple chapters from R.V. Daniels' Conscience of the Revolution, but it's a very large book, and I have not finished it. Moreover, it is clearly the case that this reorientation was no less important for Trotsky, whose theory of permanent revolution depended on an internationalist stance. However, Trotsky did not join the Bolsheviks at this stage, given that several other issues still separated Trotsky from Lenin. For instance, whilst his position now incorporated a more internationalist viewpoint, Lenin had not yet fully accepted Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. At this time, Lenin saw the consummation of the bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia by the proletariat as the spark which, along with the imperialist war, would ignite the socialist revolution in Europe. What Lenin did not accept, however, was the permanent, uninterrupted nature of that revolutionary transformation in Russia. Lenin did not realize the extent to which the bourgeois and socialist revolutions would merge into a single continuous process. Footnote. See Lenin's Several Theses in Collected Works, Volume 21. Before turning to look in more detail at how this particular difference of opinion between Lenin and Trotsky was to be resolved in the run-up to the October Revolution, it is necessary firstly to consider the effect that the outbreak of war had on Trotsky, particularly with regard to the issue of internationalism. It will be recalled that one of the central issues which continued to separate Trotsky from Lenin after the virtual resolution of their organizational differences in the period from 1905 was that of conciliationism. Trotsky had consistently taken a conciliationist position with regard to the Mensheviks, despite distancing himself both organizationally and programmatically from the Menshevik faction. Indeed, it has already been stressed that on many of the most fundamental programmatic questions, Trotsky was closer to Lenin than he was to Menshevism. What was important then, in terms of the war and internationalism, was not that Trotsky had radically developed his existing position on the nature of the revolution, as had been the case with Lenin, but that, on the contrary, Trotsky had been forced, in the light of support of the Menshevik majority for social patriotism, finally to abandon his conciliationist position. The Mensheviks' abandonment of internationalism in this period of wartime demonstrated to Trotsky their absolute bankruptcy as a revolutionary force. Hence, it appears to be the case that whilst Lenin was developing his internationalist stance, Trotsky was writing off the Mensheviks for not developing theirs. Trotsky thus fully grasped the impossibility, in fact, the undesirability of a compromise over the issue of programmatic principle. Footnote: see Deutscher's citation of Trotsky's writing in Nasze Slovo as evidence of his change of heart regarding the Mensheviks. End footnote. So far, I have demonstrated the convergence of Lenin and Trotsky over the issues of internationalism and anti-conciliationism. However, it is important to note that what has not been suggested is that the two now held identical positions regarding the war. They quite plainly did not. Footnote: Lenin supported the conversion of the imperialist war into a revolutionary civil war, a position labeled, quote, defeatism. In contrast, Trotsky held a position of, quote, pacifism, arguing that war of any kind was damaging insofar as it adversely affected the economy. Lenin himself noted this difference as late as 1917. See Leninsky Zbornik, Volume 4. End footnote. However, their differences were not sufficient to override their shared antipathy for social patriotism and social patriotism's Menshevik advocates. I'm going to look up defeatism real quick. Revolutionary defeatism is a concept made most prominent by Vladimir Lenin in World War I. Revolutionary defeatism is based on the Marxist idea of class struggle. Arguing that the proletariat could not win or gain when fighting a war under capitalism, Lenin declared the proletariat's true enemy as the imperialist leaders who sent their lower classes into battle. Workers would gain more from their own nation's defeats, Lenin argued, if the war could be turned into civil war than international revolution. Initially rejected by all but the more radical at the socialist Simmerwald Conference, the concept appears to have gained support from more and more socialists, especially in Russia in 1917, after it was forcefully affirmed in Lenin's April Theses, as Russia's war losses continued, even after the February Revolution, as the provisional government kept them in the conflict. Revolutionary defeatism was also a policy of the International Communist Party under Amadeo Bordiga, which saw World War II as a reactionary war between two opposing empires, in contrast to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and Chinese Communist Party, who were then allied with Great Britain and the United States in a continuation of Dimitrov's Comintern Popular Front anti-fascist politics, which treated the war as a progressive fight for freedom and liberation from the Nazi regime. During World War I in the United Kingdom, the British socialist movement included a small minority of revolutionary defeatists such as John Maclean. Using Lenin's terminology, revolutionary defeatism can be contrasted to revolutionary defensism and to social patriotism and social chauvinism. Back to the text. Returning now to the issue touched upon above, that is the implications of Lenin's internationalist reorientation in terms of Lenin's analysis of the nature of the coming revolution. It has already been suggested that in this period, Lenin was increasingly convinced that the bourgeois and socialist revolutions in Russia would be very close together. However, it appears to be the case that this acceptance did not extend to the idea of permanent revolution, and thus the total fusion of the two revolutions until the beginning of 1917, whilst it is clear that Lenin identified the Russian bourgeois revolution as the prologue to the coming European revolution as early as October 1915, is not until the third of his Letters from Afar that Lenin began fully to grasp the logic of his own position and move increasingly towards a full acceptance of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. Here he called for the spreading of the Soviets in particular, given that they were organizations of the proletariat, armed insurrection, and Soviet rule. Furthermore, he called for the displacement from political power of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. Whilst Lenin remained cautious, claiming that such measures would not constitute socialism, in the last of Lenin's letters, Lenin talked of the democratic dictatorship taking, quote, further steps towards control of the production and distribution of the basic product, towards the introduction of quote, universal labor structure, end quote, end quote. Footnote. See Lenin's Letters from Afar in Collected Works, Volume 23, and footnote. Footnote. The footnote is just another citation of the same piece. End footnote. This de facto acceptance of Trotsky's permanent revolution was further reiterated in what became known as the April Theses. Where Lenin wrote, quote, "It is not our immediate task to, quote, introduce socialism, but only to bring social production and the distribution of products at once under the control of the Soviets and workers' deputies," end quote. Lenin. Footnote. Lenin, the tasks of the proletariat in the present revolution, end footnote. This surely implies an immediate building towards socialism in an international context of socialist revolutionary upheaval, and hence represents an acceptance of Trotsky's theory. I'm going to quickly read the Wikipedia for the April Theses. The April Theses were a series of 10 directives issued by the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin upon his April 1917 return to Petrograd and his exile in Switzerland via Germany and Finland. The theses were mostly aimed at fellow Bolsheviks in Russia and returning to Russia from exile. Lenin called for Soviets, workers' councils, to seize state power, as seen in the slogan, quote, "All power to the Soviets," denounced liberals and social revolutionaries in the provisional government, called for Bolsheviks not to cooperate with the government, and called for new communist policies. The April Theses influenced the July Days and October Revolution in the next months and are identified with Leninism. The February Revolution had resulted in the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, the collapse of Imperial Russia, and the establishment of the liberal provisional government under Georgy Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky. The provisional government was dominated mainly by liberals and moderate socialists who wanted to instigate political reform, creating a democracy with elections and an executive and constituent assembly. After the February Revolution, Lenin sought to return to Russia as soon as possible. This was problematic because Lenin was isolated in neutral Switzerland as World War I continued to be fought in neighboring states. The Swiss communist Fritz Platen managed to negotiate with the German government for the safe passage of Lenin and his company through Germany by rail in the so-called, quote, sealed train. The German government clearly hoped Lenin's return would create political unrest in Russia, which would lead to the capitulation of Russia and the end of Russian participation in the war on the Entente side, ending the war on the Eastern Front and allowing German forces to concentrate their fight against France, Britain, and Allied forces on the Western Front. Indeed, after the October Revolution resulted in the Bolshevik rise to power, this did occur with the Decree on Peace and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Once through Germany, Lenin continued to ferry by ferry to Sweden, and the remainder of the journey through Scandinavia, and subsequently arranged by Swedish communists Otto Grimlund and Ture Nerman. On the 3rd of April, according to the old Russian calendar, 1917, Lenin arrived by train to a tumultuous reception at Finland Station in Petrograd. The April theses were first published in a speech in 2 meetings on the 17th of April 1917, 4th of April according to the old Russian calendar. Some believe Lenin based this on Leon Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. They were subsequently published in the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda. In the theses, Lenin 1. Condemned the provisional government as bourgeois and urges, quote, no support for the provisional government, as, quote, the utter falsity of all its promises should be made clear, end quote. Lenin condemned World War I as a, quote, predatory imperialist war, end quote, and the, quote, revolutionary defensism, end quote, of foreign social democrat parties, calling for revolutionary defeatism. 2. Asserts that Russia is, quote, passing from the first stage of the revolution, which, owing to the insufficient class consciousness and organization of the proletariat, placed power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to its second stage, which must place power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest sectors of the peasants, end quote. 3. Recognizes that the Bolsheviks are a minority in most of the Soviets against a, quote, block of all the petty bourgeois opportunist elements, from the social cadets and the socialist revolutionaries down to the organizing committee, Chikaidze and Tseretelli, Steklov, etc., who have yielded to the influence of the bourgeoisie and spread their influence among the proletariat, end quote. 4. Calls for a parliamentary republic not to be established and calls this a, quote, retrograde step. Lenin calls for a, quote, republic of workers, agricultural laborers, peasants' deputies throughout the country from top to bottom, end quote. 5. Calls for the, quote, abolition of the police, the army, and the bureaucracy, end quote, and for the, quote, salaries of all officials, all of whom are elective and displaceable at any time not to exceed the average wage of a competent worker, end quote. 6. Calls for the, quote, weight of emphasis in the agrarian program to be shifted to the Soviets of agricultural laborers' deputies, confiscation of all landed estates, and, quote, nationalization of all lands in the country, the land to be disposed of by the local Soviets of agricultural laborers and peasants' deputies, the organization of separate Soviets of deputies of poor peasants, the setting up of a model farm on each of the large estates ranging in size from 100 to 300 desiatines, according to local and other conditions and the decisions of the local bodies, under the control of the Soviets of agricultural laborers' deputies and for the public account, end quote. 7. Calls for, quote, the immediate union of all banks in the country into a single national bank and the institution of control over it by the Soviet of workers' deputies, end quote. 8. States that, quote, it is not our immediate task to, quote, introduce socialism, but only to bring social production and the distribution of products at once under the control of the Soviets of workers' deputies, end quote. 9. Lists, quote, party tasks as, quote, immediate convocation of a party congress, end quote. Quote, alteration of the party program, mainly 1. On the question of imperialism and the imperialist war. 2. On our attitude towards the state and our demand for a, quote, commune state. Amendment of our out-of-date minimum program and the change of the party's name, end quote. Lenin notes that, quote, instead of, quote, social democracy, end quote, whose official leaders throughout the world have betrayed socialism and deserted to the bourgeoisie, the, quote, defensist and the vacillating, quote, Kautskyites, we must call ourselves the Communist Party, end quote. The name change would dissociate the Bolsheviks from the social democratic parties of Europe, supporting participation of their nation in World War I. Lenin first developed this point in his 1915 pamphlet, Socialism and War, when Lenin called the pro-war Social Democrats, quote, social chauvinists. 10. Calls for a new, quote, revolutionary international, an international against the social chauvinists and against the, quote, center, end quote, end quote. This latter became the Communist International, Third International, which was formed in 1919. After the February Revolution, Bolshevik leaders returning from exile, such as Lev Kamenev, were arguing a much more moderate line that Russian involvement in the war could be justified and that there should be cooperation with the liberals in the provisional government. However, Lenin's arguments reflected those made by leading Bolsheviks in Petrograd at the time of the February Revolution, such as Alexander Shliapnikov. Joseph Stalin, who had initially supported cooperation with the provisional government, changed his position upon reading the April theses and spoke in favor of the program at the Bolshevik city meeting in Petrograd. After a heated discussion at the 7th All-Russian Conference of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Bolsheviks, between April 24th and 29th, with the participation of 133 delegates, the April theses received the support of the majority of delegates from the field and formed the basis of the policy of the entire party. Back to the text. Trotsky wrote in his History of the Russian Revolution that the events of early 1917 forced Lenin to accept the theory of permanent revolution. Indeed, as Liebman notes, Lenin's writings in the early part of 1917 represent a resolution by Lenin of his previous untenable position, proletarian leadership in the coming Russian Revolution, but the restriction of the revolution's aims resulting from the imposition of bourgeois democratic boundaries, which logically meant that the party, or social democracy as a whole, would be forced into the position of holding the masses back once in power in order to prevent them spontaneously engaging in a permanent revolutionary process as they became aware of their own true interests. Footnote. For a discussion of whether or not Lenin actually rejected the theory of permanent revolution as latest suggested here, see Marcel Liebman. End footnote. In fact, Trotsky himself made a similar point in his History, when Trotsky argued that in not seeing the peasants as socialist allies, cooperation with the peasants could only mean that the proletariat would eventually have to give up its socialist aspirations. This, for Trotsky, was the essential weakness of Lenin's position prior to his acceptance of the theory of permanent revolution. I'll quickly read the Wikipedia entry for History of the Russian Revolution. History of the Russian Revolution is a 3-volume book by Leon Trotsky on the Russian Revolution of 1917. The first volume is dedicated to the political history of the February Revolution and the October Revolution to explain the relations between these two events. The book was initially published in Germany in 1930. History of the Russian Revolution was originally published in Russian, but History of the Russian Revolution was translated into English by Max Eastman in 1932. The English translation of the second volume, originally consisting of 2 parts, is split into 2 volumes. History of the Russian Revolution was considered anti-Stalinist in the Soviet Union, was not published in Russia until 1997. Bracket, citation needed, end bracket. Leon Trotsky was a leading figure in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in October 1917. Trotsky was expelled from the party and exiled by Joseph Stalin. In January 1929, Trotsky was banished from the Soviet Union. During Trotsky's exile period in Turkey, Trotsky wrote this book on the Isle of Prinkipo. The history of the Russian Revolution tells the story of the February and October revolutions in Russia, which took place in 1917. This book is important due to its being an account of a major historical event by a participant and theorist. When speaking of himself, Trotsky writes in the third person in order to avoid subjectivism, stating that, quote, the subjective tone, inevitable in autobiographies or memoirs, is not permissible in a work of history, end quote. It is considered an important and unique work as a history of a major event written by someone who took a leading role in it. The book is divided into 3 volumes. Volume 1, The Overthrow of Tsarism, Volume 2, The Attempted Counter-Revolution, Volume 3, The Triumph of the Soviets. Volume 1, The Overthrow of Tsarism, deals with the overthrow of Tsarism in the February Revolution and the provisional government's attempts at ruling the country. The first volume explains the historical reasons why the democratic regime that replaced Tsarism, quote, proved wholly non-viable, end quote. Book 2, The Attempted Counter-Revolution. The Attempted Counter-Revolution covers the period from the July days to the last coalition of the provisional government in September. The Triumph of the Soviets. Volume 3, Triumph of the Soviets, deals with the national question, the preparation of power, and finally the October insurrection. The basic motivation of Trotsky behind writing this piece was to translate the experience of the revolution into both a teaching tool and a weapon in the revolution. Isaac Deutscher, Trotsky's biographer, described the history of the Russian Revolution as Trotsky's, quote, crowning work both in scale and power and is the fullest expression of Trotsky's ideas on revolution, end quote. Trotsky himself says, quote, the history of a revolution, like every other history, ought first of all to tell what happened and how. That, however, is little enough. From the telling, it ought to become clear why it happened thus and not otherwise, end quote. Trotsky. In his note about the author in the first English translation, Eastman wrote that, quote, this present work will take its place in the record of Trotsky's life as one of the supreme achievements of this versatile and powerful mind and will, end quote. Max Eastman. In 2017, on the centennial of the Russian Revolution, writer Tariq Ali reviewed the book and wrote that, quote, this passionate, partisan, and beautifully written account by a major participant in the revolution, written during his exile on the Isle of Principe in Turkey, remains one of the best accounts of 1917. No counter-revolutionary, conservative, or liberal has been able to compete with this telling, end quote. Tariq Ali. Back to the text. To sum up so far, Lenin's acceptance of permanent revolution in the face of the new reality meant that Lenin and Trotsky were reconciled on the remaining three issues of contention that had existed since 1905. However, whilst Lenin's acceptance of Trotsky's theory may have bridged the last major gap between the two revolutionaries, it did little for the cause of unity within the Bolshevik Party itself. The old Bolsheviks remained attached to Lenin's old two-stage revolutionary theory in the same way that they had remained attached to the pre-1905 party form. They accused Lenin of abandoning Bolshevism for Trotskyism. Footnote, see Deutscher. End footnote. The reason why Lenin revised his previous position despite Bolshevik opposition lay in the renewal of the working class spontaneity in the new period of upturn. Even in its new form, the party, with the party's large, cautious right wing, held back the spontaneous initiative of the masses. Indeed, Lenin himself recognized that this period was characterized by a mass which was, quote, 100 times more leftwards, end quote, than its leaders. Footnote, see Lenin's article, Tidbits for the quote, newborn, end quote, government, published in Collected Works, Volume 24, end footnote. Thus, in accepting permanent revolution, Lenin responded to the realities of 1917, that is, the heightened spontaneous struggle of the masses and the centrality of the Soviets in this struggle, as in 1905. Footnote, this is demonstrated further in Lenin's State and Revolution, Collected Works, Volume 25. Here Lenin ascribes a central political control role to the Soviets and makes little mention of the party. End footnote. In agreement with Lenin now on the major questions of the time, internationalism, the theory of permanent revolution, and anti-conciliationism with the Mensheviks, Trotsky was thus able to write a letter in solidarity with the Bolsheviks in the wake of the July days. In it, Trotsky argued, quote, the fact that I am not connected with Pravda and am not a member of the Bolshevik Party is not due to political difference, but to certain circumstances in our party history which have now lost significance, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote, Statement of Solidarity with, footnote, Trotsky, Statement of Solidarity with the Bolshevik leaders, published in Documents of Russian History, 1914 to 1917, end footnote. The way, then, was almost clear for Trotsky to join the Bolshevik Party. New section, Trotsky joins the party. In order fully to understand the nature and extent of the negotiations which took place over the issue of Trotsky joining the Bolshevik Party, it is necessary to present a brief outline of the Bolshevik Party as the Bolshevik Party stood in early 1917, and, in doing so, identifying both the changes that had taken place since 1903 and the problems still remaining. Whilst the party of 1917 had been popularly identified with that of 1903, in reality Bolshevism had undergone a radical transformation. This was in part a result of the huge increase in party membership after the February Revolution, which fed the fires of inter-party democracy. This can be illustrated by the relative autonomy of local organizations, which not only enjoyed a degree of freedom in the interpreting of Central Committee directives, but also gave voice to the minority groupings within their own organizations. Indeed, an indication of the level to which this change of spirit within the party was a result of the changing composition of the party at all levels can perhaps be gleaned from the figures themselves. Thomas Rigby argues that on the eve of the collapse of Tsardom, the Bolsheviks had 23,600 members. Moreover, by April, 79,000 members was the estimate, growing to somewhere around 200,000 mark by October. Whatever the precise figures, it is clear that at this time, only about 1 out of 20 members had been in the clandestine organization. The others had come in during the period of transformation and expansion. Footnote: see T.H. Rigby's Communist Party membership. I have actually an article by T.H. Rigby on this channel about Stalinism. The overview for this book, Communist Party Membership in the USSR by T.H. Rigby or Thomas Henry Rigby, says, in this comprehensive and latest statistical profile of the membership of the Communist Party during the first half-century of the Soviet regime, Professor Rigby analyzed the history of party recruitment and composition. Since the party makes vital contributions to the performance of several basic tasks in the Soviet political system, the author interprets his data mainly in functional terms. He identifies and evaluates the influence of these functional considerations on recruitment policies and on the changing patterns of membership, and determines the priorities assigned to different functions under changing circumstances. T.H. Rigby is professor of political science, Research School of Social Science, Australian National University, Studies of the Russian Institute, Columbia University, originally published in 1968. End footnote. Or not end footnote, back to the text. Footnote: T.H. Rigby, Communist Party membership, Princeton, 1968. Rigby claims that 1 week before the seizure of power, Sverdlov reported to the Central Committee that the party had 400,000 members. 4 weeks later, reports to the 7th Congress placed the number at 300,000. Subsequent recalculation gave rise to the figure of 115,000 in January 1918. Rigby concludes that whilst the figure of 400,000 may be seen as an exaggeration, it is reasonable to assume that 20,000 plus the underground to be only a fraction of the membership of 1917. End footnote. It is clearly the case that in 1917 the central organization was weak and poorly adapted to the large increase in the party's activities and membership, and that local and regional organizations not only wished for but enjoyed a large degree of freedom regarding decisions and policy making. Footnote: see Marcel Liebman. End footnote. Such a tendency towards autonomy reflected the realities of the new political life characterized by workers' initiative and spontaneity, though there did of course remain a degree of unity and cohesion within the Bolshevik Party. In terms of organizational transformation, it would appear that there was a large degree of democratization and loosening of central control, which, added to the changes seen in the years from 1905, resulted in the decreasing influence for the old Bolsheviks and their old formulas, and the elevation of the notion of the party as a living organization. Hence, Trotsky was able to talk of de-Bolshevization. In My Life, the book, Trotsky claimed that the party of 1917 was greatly transformed. Lenin had appealed to the masses for support against party leaders, launching a systematic fight against the old Bolsheviks and their adherence to the old, rigid theories and tactics, supporting a program which grew out of an analysis of real conditions. Hence, when Trotsky arrived in Russia on the 4th of May 1917 to find that his comrades in the Mezryansa were considering joining the Bolsheviks, and that Lenin had essentially triumphed over the right wing of Lenin's party, Trotsky was open to negotiations regarding his membership of the Bolshevik Party. Footnote: the Mezryansa interdistrict group was a temporary organization of socialists who were neither Bolsheviks nor Mensheviks, and who were united in their opposition to the war and social patriotism. See Isaac Deutscher. End footnote. From Lenin's notes on the meeting of Bolshevik and Mezryansa leaders on the 10th of May, it is clear that Trotsky and Trotsky's comrades were invited to join the party and offered editorial status and positions on the organization committee of the forthcoming party congress. Furthermore, at this meeting, Trotsky expressed his agreement with the issue of the Bolsheviks and the Mezryansa unifying, quote, insofar as Russian Bolshevism internationalizes itself, end quote. However, Trotsky was not only clear at this meeting that, quote, it is impossible to demand of us a recognition of Bolshevism, end quote, but also that he could never call himself a Bolshevik, particularly given that it was, quote, undesirable to stick to old labels, end quote. Old divisions had been resolved, and Lenin's party had undergone a process of de-Bolshevization. Footnote. No footnote. Trotsky thus proposed the fusing of all internationalist left groups into a newly named party at a joint congress. In fact, in the April Theses, Lenin himself had not only demanded the setting up of a commune state and a new international, but had, like Trotsky, also argued for the changing of the party's name, and he suggested the Communist Party as a suitable alternative. As Liebman suggests, Lenin realized that the Bolshevik Party was vastly different from that organization that had existed before the revolution. Indeed, in his return to Russia, he too called for a change of name. Clearly, Lenin was in support of changing the name of the Bolshevik Party, as he himself had been convinced of de-Bolshevization since 1905, when he essentially refuted his own schema of 1902 in the face of Bolshevik resistance to change. Footnote. LeBlanc disagrees with this view, arguing rather that Lenin supported a name change as a means of dissociating the Bolsheviks from the Second International. End footnote. Where's the footnote at? Sorry. Indeed, at the end of September, Lenin wrote a document to the Petrograd Soviet praising Trotsky's internationalist stance and his work among the Mezryansa in support of a merger under such terms. Moreover, in March 1918, he got agreement from the party as a whole. New section, some conclusions. It has been the central aim of this article to challenge the generally accepted view that Lenin and Trotsky were separated by the organizational question from the writing of what is to be done until the eve of the October Revolution. At the center of this challenge is the premise that whilst the evolution of Lenin's organizational thinking from 1895 to 1902 did indeed result in the organizational break between him and Trotsky, the events of 1905 led him further to revise his position, and in doing so essentially to end that division. This period of revolutionary upheaval resulted not only in the theoretical unity of Lenin and Trotsky over the issue of organizational form, but also in the transformation of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party into a more democratic, broader-based, and less centrally planned party form. Although the years of downturn witnessed a late organizational regression on the part of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, this was largely a reaction to the decline of the party by Tsarist repression, rather than a return to the principles of what is to be done. Having dismissed the organizational explanation, I have argued that the principal issues separating Lenin from Trotsky from 1905 onward were the theory of permanent revolution and its inherent internationalism, and Trotsky's conciliationism with regard to the Mensheviks. Thus, when the developments of the Russian situation and the outbreak of the First World War led to the resolution of these differences, the way was cleared for Trotsky and Lenin to unite within a single party, a most pragmatic outcome in view of the revolutionary events of the period. That's the end of this article. Thank you so much for listening.